It's fun with food, and you get the cake and get a little bit energized. You know how that is. So we'll start the second part of the day. So we have 3 more sessions, 2 more presentation sessions, and then we have a very kind of creative session in the end. It's going to be really interesting. We also have, just a reminder again, we have probably close to, in addition to everyone here in the room, we have close to 50 or more than 50 on the call here as well. So just a quick reminder, when we're getting a question from especially the people in the back, just repeat it before answering, just in respect for the people on the call here. The next presentation up is a presentation from Zach at Apache. It's something that's a pretty cool topic, close to my heart, I guess, which is related to this. Most of the reservoirs that were, at least after we completed the rock, they're probably complex in terms of fracture geometries and stuff. So how can we account for, mimic some of that with other parameters that are more readily available to us? So on that note, Zach, I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you. So yeah, for those I haven't met, Zach Lathrop, as Matthias said, with Apache. Been with Apache about 8 years and work a lot with Braden, so I feel like it's good getting to follow around like a little RTA celebrity. So. I know you hate that I said that. But, so yeah, topic presentation, like you said, so relative permeability, as we're kind of like looking at this idea of introducing the delta or the non-uniformity of fractures into our workflow, because it's not a part of our workflow now. It's just kind of what is that impact going to be to what our current workflow is. So starting off is just the acceptance of, and again, this is from like a internal presentation a while back, looking into this idea in the workflow. So I pulled slides from that. So some of it is going to be a little bit artistic, I guess, from that regard. But so on the left is just kind of the acceptance of the idea of asymmetric or non-uniform fracs, and so a couple of different reasonings behind accepting that we were talking about. We look at a lot of fiber data, and you see different times of hits on fiber data, so you know at least they're non-uniform. And there's data and literature out there on asymmetry as well. If you haven't seen the 2-balloon experiment, I think that was pretty interesting to look up. If you have 2 balloons that are connected and try to blow both of them up, only one of them blows up. It's kind of like a classical experiment that was tied to a research paper. I can put the reference in the backup here. But the idea is that symmetric fracs is like an unstable critical point. So not just because of stress shadow and heterogeneity, but also just that we're in like a toughness dominated regime that we expect to have asymmetry. And so the implications of that on RTA is, as we've talked about in this project and some of the other literature we discussed. Obviously, a fracture, like kind of my mental model, I guess, was like the closer you are to the wellbore, the more likely that your cluster is going to see interlinear flow sooner. Whereas if you get out more towards the tips, there's a lower probability. And so you can imagine those 2 elements along the fracture would have very different time to interlinear flows, different GOR profiles. And so what's the impact when you roll those together into one model? And then more importantly, historically, we've just been using like uniform models in our RTA. That's kind of the underlying assumption of these uniform fractures. So how have we been able to match history match production so well and get pretty good forecasts from our workflow historically? And so this is kind of what we were working through, like proposing as what looks like a similar character. So on the top is just sensitivities at different levels of non-uniformity. So completely uniform would be the red one, which is with delta of 0.5 for those who have dug into that work. The middle is just like mildly non-uniform, and then even more non-uniform with the green. And you can see, basically, we're looking with the numerical RTA plot, or I think it's called the Bowie plot in the whitson plus workflow. We have it labeled as instantaneous LFP, but basically how that slope is changing based on the amount of non-uniformity, which you can kind of make sense conceptually. Those closer fractures going through interlinear flow quickly, whereas the portions of the fracture that don't have the next cluster as close of distance are going to basically stay in that transitional flow for longer, or make that transitional go on for longer. We're seeing a similar shape when we play with sensitivities on our relative permeability. So that's the bottom plot there, and you can see that the general idea was just that we're adjusting the slope of the instantaneous LFP plot. So when we're still in infinite acting linear flow, it's flat, and that's we can match that either way, right? but it's this slope, and whether our actual data is going to cross-cut this slope or align with one of these slopes when we change the workflow. And sure enough, basically the idea is we're changing the numerator by changing the non-uniformity, but by changing the relative permeability, we can change the denominator in the equation that makes this plot to basically come up with the exact same slope. And so just to kind of pause, I guess, anchor it, because that's kind of the main point of the example we're going to do in practice, is just how we could, with a Midland Basin example, change the non-uniformity that's going into the model, and then history match that by then adjusting the rel perm, which, if your RTA journey is like mine, then seeing that there's non-uniqueness in the workflow and not realizing it's there, that's a special kind of headache. Definitely can just go in circles modeling forever until you realize your limitations or where the levels of non-uniformity are. Okay, so as I said, it's a Midland Basin Wolfcamp well. That's the example here. It's kind of out of scope on some of where some of this is coming from. It just mainly just wanted to show like the concept of how we were playing with this. So again, I think Matisse has shown, I've seen it, and I think the Cunha paper, a couple examples of a similar slide to this or image, but this was how we were explaining it, is we were basically binning the distribution of cluster spacing from another workflow and then creating single frac models to replicate that. So one of the things that we're still looking at testing and playing with is those have seen the work from Cunha, how we do the getting delta from the slope of the diagnostic plot. This is a little bit different workflow, but it comes up with a similar looking distribution of single frac models to build that non-uniform case. And so I'm just going to step through what the match looks like as we incorporate that. So first, I'm just showing cum oil here on the plot. The black is the actual production, and then gray is our match that we got with the uniform model assumption. We introduced the non-uniformity, that distribution of single frac models, and it definitely messes with the match quite a bit. Oil is much lower, but if I were to run that out, that oil does start to catch up a little bit, but it's not a good history match at this point. But it's pretty reasonable. I don't have great constraints for rel perm. If somebody does, let me know. So freely adjusting rel perm here, it really wasn't too large of an adjustment, and was able to get back to the red line, which is a perfect match with the non-uniform model here. And so the idea of, if I had a different distribution non-uniformity, could I just tweak rel perm a little bit differently, get a similar match? That was kind of an interesting observation for us, as well as looking at the long-term implications of this. So going back to the kind of teal line, bluish green line is that original uniform model match, whereas the red line is this updated one with the non-uniformity and the rel perm adjustment. And the long-term oil forecast really isn't so different, but just was pointing out that even the places where we do see the difference is where we have the most uncertainty, because that's where we're getting into saturations that we haven't seen. So the last piece of this is looking at GOR. I hid that for a reason, just go one step at a time. But so in either case, we can match the actual data, and I smoothed out the pressure profile a little bit. There's a little bit of gap there, but trust me, I could get it to match almost perfectly up to the point of actual production data, and then forward from that point, we have a very different shape to the GOR profile. So this is where we start to kind of scratch our head a little bit. So the original uniform match just goes on forever increasing GOR, whereas with this non-uniform case, the GOR is actually flattening and even dropping with how extreme the non-uniformity. It'd be equivalent to around a delta of 0.3 is what this came out to when I was kind of back calculating that. And so the reasoning for this is, right, you've got distribution of different single frac models, right? And the tightest ones at the 15-foot cluster spacing are going through GOR, increasing GOR for pretty much to life, and then losing productivity as we have a lot of gas saturation. Whereas the much looser ones are continuing to see more contact, more OEP, right, and continue to get more productivity, or don't see their productivity fall off in the same way. And so, with time, this is dominating the shape of that full profile in the early time, but as time goes on, you kind of roll over more closer to the red profile as those are contributing more. So that's kind of a very different implication on the long-term forecast, and something that we're kind of still thinking through. We don't have a whole lot of modern completions with more than, say, 5 years of production data where we would expect to see this, but I'm also not expecting that we're going to see GOR profiles, flatten and even go down, but just something that as we introduce this delta workflow, or this idea of looking at non-uniformity in our numerical RTA workflow, to be cognizant of that there is some threshold where it starts to occur. So yeah, that's pretty much just an example to go through, and the conclusions and questions here. The big one is just this idea that our historical workflows with uniform models, like maybe the tweaking of rel perm to match that production data, was in a way like tweaking for non-uniformity. The other alternative could just be that non-uniformity in practice isn't enough to see these effects. So looking forward to diving into that more. The levels of asymmetry obviously have a pretty big impact on the GOR profile. As you're closer to 0.5, that's what we've traditionally seen. But as you move to more and more non-uniformity, things start to look very different. So important to figure that out for that reason. And so, yeah, just going forward, how can these other workflows or tools that we've talked about in this group kind of help with this? And I'm especially excited as whitCon is including the delta parameter into the numerical RTA, because in order to do this, if you notice, like it was all Excel, because every one of those single frac models having to rerun each time you're trying to calibrate the model. If we have the ability to run through and do that sensitivities, I think we can learn a lot faster. So looking forward to that. So that's all I had. Open up for questions or comments, and welcome any feedback.
Quick question. So when you look at this non-uniform behavior, have you had a chance to compare semi-modern completions that are single well, the HBP type wells, to multi-well pad development, to see if there is some signature where the multi-well pad development doesn't see as much signature of non-uniformity because of the well spacing interaction of offset well fracs or anything like that?
Yeah, so we started to look at that for sure. It's kind of this cutoff in time. Oh, sorry. Yep, I got to reset. Got it. See, that's all I have. Like another question already. So the question was, and tell me if I got this right, but basically comparing maybe standalone wells or legacy wells, different completions, to more modern or tightly spaced wells, and are we seeing a difference in the level of this non-uniformity signature? All right. So yeah, there's an interesting cutoff in time, for us, 2017, 2018 or so, maybe right around there, where a lot of our completions transition to something with much tighter clusters, where maybe the stress shadow effect is causing more non-uniformity versus looser. Kind of a mixed bag. I would say they definitely have different GOR profiles, but the clarity of, especially as you get out past 5 years, we're still kind of trying to see if that's going to be abundantly clear or not, but TBD.
How you can differentiate between skin factor or conductivity, let's say, low conductivity versus, non-uniform?
Say the last part again. Skin.
How you can differentiate between, let's assume in the well have any skin or damage or low factor conductivity. How you can differentiate between non-uniform fracture activity versus, those typical damage activity?
Yeah. So the question is, if you have low conductivity or skin damage, how can we differentiate that from non-uniformity? Yeah, I would say it's tough. I mean, we also have some diagnostics for those that we've talked about with this, for like with the early time data and the shape of and the numerical RTA plot and some of the other diagnostic tools for that. But as you're looking later time, I think that's one of the big learnings for me here, was that it is hard to tell the difference between non-uniformity and some other model parameters. Whether it's damage or skin, or the big one for me here was rel perm, just because it's kind of open question. But another one would be if you don't have PVT calibration, right? It could have a similar effect as well. But hopefully we have good PVT calibration we talked about earlier today. So
just a comment on that, which is very important. So skin and damage, that will give you a delta higher than 0.5 initially. And if it is not uniform, that will convert into a delta between 0 and 0.5. So that's like the perfect example of that. So those two signatures will be very different.
Yeah. Yeah.
Things like, pressure depending perm and frac, and also in the matrix, or if you have variable fracture connectivity along the fracture distance, that will be hard.
Can you repeat that, or do you have your? I got it. So skin. Matthias is saying that skin or damage, or some of those we'll have. He says skin or damage have very different points of the data where we'll see that. So maybe a higher than 0.5 delta in the early time data. Like we'll see that differently than, say, what non-uniformity, or maybe that would be mixed with some of the other parameters in the model. Accurate. Yes.
Have you hypothesized what the effect of non-uniformity will be on well spacing?
Have we hypothesized what the effect of non-uniformity would be on well spacing? That is actually pretty much exactly what kicked off the conversation to begin with. Yes, yeah, the question was essentially with our completion design, and can we use RTA to help with that conversation of, at some point between completion design and spacing, it's not just about targeting the most effective completion size, but also to design what the symmetry of that, it's going to be asymmetric, but level of asymmetry of that job looks like, and how that could be interpreted for a different optimization of spacing and completion design coupled, basically. So I would say, if there's a large amount of asymmetry, right, you may go to looser spacing that maybe you didn't need to go to as looser spacing when you could have. Yeah, that's kind of the idea.
Very good. Thank you, Zach.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
This is a super interesting topic, and it's definitely something with just having the fractional RTA diagnostic plots in the software made it, at least for me, much easier to do these evaluations. And when we get it in a part of the numerical RTA workflow as well, it's going to be even more powerful, I think. Next up, we're going to get one of the Bowies up, the little brother. So I'll let you do the introduction of yourself, since you have a little bit of that in the slides here. But it's in short about extending numerical RTA to multi-fluid systems. Just wish you luck.
Thank you. Cool. Yeah, so I'm Jordan Bowie. I work at ARC Resources, reservoir engineer. And so just an introduction to this, a little bit about me. I'm a reservoir engineer at ARC Resources. I am not the Bowie, famous for the Bowie diagnostic plot, but I do share about half his DNA, so maybe I can take some credit for it. A little bit about ARC. We're a Canadian oil and gas producer, almost exclusively producing from the Montney, about 340,000 BOE a day of production. And a bit about the layered oil and gas systems that I'll be talking about today. Some of the wells that we produce, they appear to be like a mix of oil and gas wells, but there'll be a little bit more on that later. So to start, just an overview of the presentation. First off, I'll go over why bother with these layered gas and oil models. Then I'll show how you could apply this layered system and apply the numerical RTA workflow to that. I'll show some synthetic data testing, an application on some actual data, and then a bit of a quick discussion on implications of what that could mean. So first off, with why bother with these layered gas oil models, kind of take it back to CGR behavior of tight gas condensate wells. So in a tight gas condensate system, essentially all of the condensate that drops out in the matrix is going to stay there for the rest of the life of the well. So all of the produced condensate is going to be coming in the gas phase in the reservoir. And this means that the producing CGR is going to be equal to the vaporized oil gas ratio at the flowing bottom hole pressure, and we can measure that in the lab or predict it with PVT. Here is some of the lab samples from the area that I'm mostly looking at, and I don't know if you can really see units much. It's pretty lean. Typical producing pressures were so around 4,000 to 10,000 kPa or 600 to 1,500 psi for the Americans. Can only expect about 3 to 10 barrels a million here. There are other parts of the Montney that are richer, but this is the areas right offsetting where we're looking at. And then what we see in our actual production behavior, we have oil wells on one side of this area, and then there's wells in the middle, and then we have more gas wells that are down here. Metering is a little bit messy with allocation and wet metering versus separation. But so it's kind of, what do we do with these wells in the middle where they're too oily to model as gas wells and they're too gassy to model as oil wells? So kind of our explanation for this is that in the intermediate areas, there's interbedded oil and gas layers. And so this is not a conventional model where the oil and gas are in a vertical equilibrium. It does imply the vertical perm is near zero, but we do have some pressure gradient data across the field that kind of agrees with this. Then the question kind of comes like, how has this come to be? So a bit of a geological background. The Montney is a source rock. Oil is generated in the cooler, shallower regions, and gas is generated in the deeper, hotter regions. We use a maximum temperature of 455 C as our dividing line between the gas and oil windows. But you'll see that we have very dry gas plays that we're never in areas hot enough to generate gas. And so on a geological time scale, because of density differences, that down dip gas is going to migrate upwards. In areas with higher permeability, it's going to sweep forward further. And in areas with tighter permeability, then that oil is still going to be there. And then what you end up with is these transition areas where some of the layers have been swept by that geologic scale gas flood, and some of the layers are still the original oil that was sourced there. And then just a kind of question, couldn't we match this by varying rel perm or PVT behavior from area to area? And we probably could. It is a fairly short distance, like you're within one section over it could change dramatically. We found that this model works pretty well for matching behavior of the wells. The fraction of pay that's gas pay seems to consistently vary in these transition zones, and we can map that and accurately predict what new wells are going to produce like. At the end of the day, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And so if we're getting the basic outline of the CAT and we can use that, then things are good. So then a bit of how I apply the numerical RTA workflow to this layered oil and gas system. So first off, we assume that the oil pay and the gas pay are producing at the same bottom hole pressure and that they don't interact until they're in the wellbore. At that point, it's kind of beyond what we care about. So therefore, we can basically just apply the same numerical RTA workflow to both the oil and the gas as separate models and then add them back together to get our final match. Major complication of this is there is oil or condensate in the gas reservoir and there's gas in the oil reservoir. So the solution that I have here is that we basically use the gas production from our oil model to predict what to kind of partition this into the oil associated gas and the free gas, and vice versa for the oil or condensate from the gas pay. This does mean that when you make changes to one model, you're affecting the other model, so it becomes a very iterative process, but it does actually work pretty well. There's 4 unknowns here versus the usual RTA. We have oil LFP, oil hydrocarbon pore volume, gas LFP, and gas hydrocarbon pore volume. And I use hydrocarbon pore volumes instead of oil in place and gas in place just because they add together nicer. So kind of a quick simplified example, if it's just dry gas pay, so there's no condensate in there at all, then now just the oil production. So we can use the numerical RTA on just the oil production. We have our flat, this is synthetic data. We have our flat period and then it drops off. Can't use GOR as a diagnostic in this case because we don't know which gas is free gas and which gas is associated. But if we can get that matched, then we can kind of partition it into free gas and associated gas, and then perform the numerical RTA on just the gas pay to estimate gas LFP and gas hydrocarbon pore volume. Slightly more complicated example, I'm actually going to just pull this up. Let's see if I can manage this. I've gone to the wrong presentation now. Let's see if I can. Yes. Okay, so what I've got is this is my spreadsheet for doing this match. What I find most helpful with because the oil and gas models are interacting and affecting each other, instead of varying LFP for each phase individually, I set the total LFP and then the fraction of that is gas or oil pay. The nice thing about that is in the early time, both the gas and oil pay production is only governed by LFP. So then I can use the early time GOR behavior. And what I can see is that my actual GOR is in between what the oil or the gas GOR would be. So then what I can do is just tune my fraction of, oh, that was a pretty lucky grab. Tune that to kind of just match my early time GOR behavior. And then now what I'm going to do is pull up this LFP line. And you can kind of see as I move these knobs on, especially on this instantaneous LFP graph, all of the data points are moving because the partitioning between free gas and free oil is changing. So I'll kind of try to match those to, let's just move that up a little bit. Match the early time there. Then I like to match the larger of the two phases because that one's probably going to have more impact than the other one. So I'm just going to turn my gas hydrocarbon pore volume down a little bit further. And good enough of matching the data. And now you can see that I'm starting to see that infinite acting signature on the oil that I couldn't see before. So now I can try to match my oil hydrocarbon pore volume, turning that down. And getting a pretty good match. If you take a little more time and fine tune these, it's obviously synthetic data, I can get a perfect match. But I found that it doesn't really matter which way I turn the knobs. Like this is the way I found the fastest way to get to the final answer, but you end up with the same answer. So there's, with synthetic data at least, where you can trust that there isn't really non-uniqueness going on there. So yeah, flip back to the slideshow. I can figure out how to do this. Okay. You've lost me. Appear to have lost my presenter view, but then kind of applying this to some actual data, we can see on the instantaneous LFP plot for this, the oil is pretty flat. That's infinite acting flow, can get a match, but our GOR is quite different, especially early time. Doesn't look that big, but this is a log scale. So we got our good oil match, but we're actually missing about 50% of the gas early time. That's pretty substantial. If this is your forecast, this is not a great forecast. And because we're in infinite acting flow for the whole time, we can't try to turn up or turn down our oil in place to get our GOR to rise that way. So kind of stuck. Adding in, just in this case, 7% gas pay, all of a sudden we get a much better match to the gas rates. Both our oil and gas pay are showing infinite acting flow for the entire history. But so we can get, and then we can take that 7% and start mapping that and trying to find what are the edges of our transition and so on. So a couple of just discussion points, pros and cons of this. It does rely on pretty confident estimates of PVT and rel perm. In this case, we do have wells on the outside of the transition zone where they are 100% gas wells. We're at least fairly confidently saying are 100% oil wells. So we can use those as our two endpoints. One flaw in this is that GOR behavior is very dependent on fracture conductivity, and because you're using the gas production from the oil model to partition out free gas, then you need to have a good idea what your fracture conductivity is. Kind of talked about it in other presentations, but you can usually see some signatures on the instantaneous LFP chart that say you need more fracture conductivity or you need less. So you have to use that. You can't use GOR as a diagnostic there either. One pro is that compared to using rel perm or PVT to match these transitional wells, we're getting out a simpler single parameter fraction of pay that's gas, which can be more easily trended than if you were definitely not a PVT expert or rel perm, but there's a lot of knobs there to turn. So you'd have to be very intentional about how you tried to go about it a different way. Kind of one flaw with anything where we're just introducing more knobs to turn is we're going to make it easier to get a match, but is it the right match? It's hard to say. The models have worked well for us for forecasting. We found them useful, so we're going to keep on using it. And then using the numerical RTA principles just helps us more quickly zero in on that versus our old workflows, modeling multi-layer systems, and there's a lot of knobs to turn, and it takes longer to do the runs. So we found it pretty useful. And with that, open the floor to any questions.
2 questions.
Yep.
First, where have you learned to draw that nice cartoons? That's the first question.
And
the second one is this number of, you mentioned 455 Celsius, that's the transition line. That's like 821 Fahrenheit.
Yep, so 2 questions there for the people online. First off, where did I draw these cartoons? It's a Excala draw, it's called. It's a free website. It's pretty sweet. I like it. I was really missing a whiteboard during the COVID lockdown stuff. I didn't have one in my apartment, and so I found this, and it's great.
Is this a software, or are you drawing like on a software?
It's a software, and it's not like free-handed. Like it makes it look like I free-handed it, which is what I like. But no, I'm typing things in and I'm drawing lines, and it's making them curves. And, yeah,
Love it.
It is great. And then the other question was this Tmax of 455C. That's not the current temperature. That was the maximum temperature that rock was exposed to over its entire life. So, yeah.
This just shows how much geology OPS knows.
Yeah, I had to learn that too. I was confused because I was like, we're like 70 degrees now. Like, where is this coming from? Yeah, that's. Yep.
Porosity, what is that?
What is the benefit of this method versus, say, just modeling a composite PVT like a near critical fluid as an aggregate for the system?
So the question is, what is the advantage of this workflow versus just modeling as like a near critical PVT trend? Really, we found that it works, I guess, is what my answer to that is. We probably could match it in other ways, but this has been pretty reliable, and kind of the real acid test for us with any of these workflows is, can we predict new well performance? And it has worked for us. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways to do these models and a lot of ways to approach it, but especially with kind of the geological background of kind of this, where we have dry gas plays within areas, like we know that there is migration happening, and so kind of, yeah, it fits a lot of the boxes.
I guess we need a ratio for that as well, right? I mean, say like how much is the gas, how much oil, it's migration, right? It's not, they're not. Right?
No, my question was simple, right? We produce a certain fluid. Let's take a permanent example. What if we just pretend that there are no 2 fluids in the system? It's just one mixture.
The question then would be, how do you get that composition?
Just an initial BOR.
Yeah, and so to be perfectly honest, a lot of this work is before we playing with whitSim Plus, and just generating a new PVT is a little bit messy, and having 2 PVT sets that we quite like and seem to work for us, and then having a way to blend them together with this has worked well. But yeah, you probably could get good matches by treating it as a single fluid. But yeah.
Have you tried to use it to resolve like reservoir parameters? Because you get a different LFP and LBIT for the bases, right? So you get like different half lengths and everything. So how do you resolve that?
So the question is, have we tried to resolve out like half lengths and things? And usually, I guess we have, not so much with the numerical RTA, but just with modeling in the past. you do have to make some assumptions about permeability, especially like, is the oil pay lower perm than the gas? It should be by this migration workflow. How much lower should it be? Because you have A root K, then like how is that area? If you assume the same half lengths, then you just have a kind of fraction of height. Or there's a couple ways to tie it together. It definitely gets into the non-uniqueness.
That would be kind of an elegant way of it, doing the height part, but then you can keep the XF the same.
Yeah, and that's what we usually do is we have the same XF and then different height, somewhat different perm between them, but you get very non-unique with that. And then we've tried to correlate kind of fraction of the height of the pay to, like, if we set our cutoffs differently on our logs, maybe stuff above 6% is going to be swept by gas and less than 6% porosity, but that kind of gets beyond the scope of this one.
Excellent. I think we're good.
Cool.
Thanks so much. And for those of you who interacted a lot with Braden, it's like
How similar these brothers are in terms of how they talk. It's a little bit it's almost like seeing Marcus Hayes and Curtis together in a room. Some of you might have seen him in like Najee probably saw Curtis in the 90s and 80s. Apparently it's like seeing a ghost from the past. It's just a good thing. Anyway, the last presentation now before we'll take another break is a presentation by Ovintiv, and that's a presentation by Ruth. And she's going to present on some more practical aspects when she's been running 50 plus wells in the Anadarko Basin on the numerical RTA workflow. So that'll be very exciting. I'm just trying to find my mouse here on the, there we go. So Ruth, whenever you have the time, let's see here.
I have time.
Do you have time? Okay. Let's see here, now it comes up like, okay, maybe we have to have an early break here because it says that I need to repair it.
Uh-oh.
It's not a good thing. Okay, I'll just I'll just blame you then, huh? Yeah. Every time Jason is showing other tools, it's like we should be in good shape. Can't you just introduce yourself real quick while I do?
Yes, I can. Sorry, I'm Ruth Hume. So I'm a reservoir engineer with Ovintiv. Working on what we call our reservoir characterization team right now. So we get to do all the fun technical projects that the development team doesn't have time to mess with since they're running the rigs.
Did you go to A&M?
Yes, I went to Texas A&M.
I think you have some friends here.
or not. Or not.
That was a perfect. Do you see how smooth that was, Tyler? You see how like we practiced this. Anyways, go on.
Okay, so I guess that takes care of my introduction here. So like Matthias said, I'm going to be sharing some practical experiences that I've had doing an RTA across the Anadarko Basin at scale. So I'll get into this later, but I've done about 60-something wells at this point. So, okay, so before I get into the NRTA part of the presentation, I wanted to give you guys some background on what we're currently doing with RTA at Ovintiv. So right now we have a single phase analytical workflow. We start by identifying flow regimes in our log plot, and then we go into our RTA plot. We pick our A root K, time to end of linear flow, pretty standard workflow. After that, we go into a single phase history match model, and we use that to try to better understand our reservoir quality and just get a better feel for what's going on beyond the classical RTA. Currently, we're applying that to both our undeveloped and our developed locations. On the undeveloped front, we use the RTA analysis that we've done on all the parents across the field to get a feel for what our reservoir quality might be in new DSUs that we're going to be infilling. We also use the analysis to generate production type curves for those new DSUs. On the developed front, we use our analytical RTA to identify flow regimes, like I've already talked about, also to identify skin damage, and also to look for frac hit damage. So We found a lot of value in this workflow, but there are some challenges, namely the current workflow doesn't really help us with any density and completion optimization. And so when we heard about what some of you guys were doing with the NRTA, we kind of got excited. We thought maybe this is the way that we can, work on addressing these challenges with density and completion optimization. So what we decided to do was kind of replicate our analytical RTA workflow, but in an NRTA space. So we didn't want to just do 1 or 2 wells with NRTA. We wanted to push this out across our basin at scale. So whitCon helped us to get started with this by uploading over 150 wells into their software, which I know was a tremendous amount of work for them. So thank you all very much again for doing that. Once their hard work was done, that's when my hard work started. 150 wells, that's a lot of our NRTA to do. But to date, I've gotten through about 40% of those wells, and it's been a really interesting process. It's been a really good learning process. I couldn't have done so well and gotten through so many wells without a lot of weekly check-in meetings with Matthias. So another shout out to Matthias for that. I kept telling him, I'm sure you're getting sick of me because I keep calling you with questions. But really, the whitCon team has been such a pleasure to work with because they're always super fast getting back with me when I got stuck or when I was having problems. Very receptive to ideas, feedback. It's been a very, very good process with them. So what I wanted to do at this point was kind of share what our learnings are so far. So I'm not going to go through all these bullet points because I'm about to cover those in the slides to come. But really, our results so far have been encouraging. We still want to complete the NRTA analysis on the rest of the wells that we have uploaded. And so that's an ongoing project for me. So we still need to do that to really determine whether or not, NRTA is going to be able to help us with that completion and density optimization. But we've seen some really encouraging results. I'm going to share a lot of the things we like about the workflow so far. I'm going to share a couple of the challenges I'm having and just also some of the things that we're still working on. All right, so I titled this part of the presentation, Work is Easier in whitCon Plus. I have done a lot of RTA in Harmony. I don't know how many of you have also done that. I find whitCon Plus to be much more user-friendly, just overall. I'm not trying to be a commercial for them, I promise. But I really do love a lot of the things about the application. One thing being the consistent PVT initialization that it starts with. And that just gives you right off the bat a really good starting place that you feel confident in. I know we've talked about flowing bottom hole pressure with the tuning. I'm excited to try that. But again, I love the ease of the calculations in the software, and especially the smoothing feature, which just makes the analysis cleaner, just remove some of that noise. That's been great. On the analytical RTA front, I have been doing that as part of the workflow since we've done a lot of that on our own in Harmony. And I've been testing out the AutoFit feature, which I also really like. It's certainly not perfect, but it gives you a really good starting point to speed up the analysis, and we really see it as having the potential to help us push out RTA over a large number of wells very quickly. So another really good feature. They also added a comment feature, which I really like using to help me kind of pick flow regimes on my log plot and then make sure I'm fitting my A root K line through that same set of data just to make sure we're really consistently picking that A root K. So all of these things make the analysis really nice. Okay, so once I'd gotten through these 60 wells, I dumped all the data out, and I guess I'll give a little aside to their exporting feature is really easy to use as well, and they added a bunch of columns for me when I asked for it, which was great. And the first thing we kind of wanted to do was just test kind of our Harmony comparison of the classical single-phase RTA against the whitCon equivalent of that. So again, this is just the single-phase classical RTA, but we just wanted to gain some comfort around how are those analyses comparing? Are we getting the same ballpark answers? And that way we can have more confidence going through with the rest of our analysis. And so the answer was yes, those two do trend really well. And so we felt like that checked out really well. So the next thing I looked at was, other parameters. What do we see when we compare our Harmony single phase model now to whitCon's three-phase NRTA model. And so, for example, the SRV permeability, frac half length, I plotted those up and just compared, what do those distributions look like for those 60 wells? And what we're seeing is that the Whitson three-phase model is yielding higher SRV perms and higher frac half lengths, which makes physical sense. And so, everyone on the team really likes that this is making more physical sense because we're able to include all three phases in the models. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, we're interested to see how the NRTA can help us with our completions optimization. So kind of, this is still a bit of a work in progress, but a step one check was to look at our A-root Ks and our LFPs from Whitson and just cross-plot those real quick with some of our completion parameters. We had looked at this in the past with our analytical single-phase models, and we didn't really see very strong trends. So I was excited that when I plotted up this data, we could see a stronger correlation with our LFP and our completion parameters. So again, this is kind of work in progress, not done. We need to do some more on the additional wells and take a look at this, but I'm encouraged by the fact that we've got a stronger correlation, so hopefully this will be able to help us inform our completion decisions. All right, so some things that we're still working on here. In our current analytical single-phase RTA approach, we found a pretty strong correlation with production and our A-root K. And that made our RTA workflow very meaningful to us in our company because we felt like we were able to tie the RTA analysis directly to production. So again, one of the checks and kind of things that we wanted to look at was, do we see the same kind of correlation with the three-phase LFP? So yes, we do. Obviously, your LFPs from three-phase model are going to be higher than your classical RTA, which is why you see that shift up. The R-squared isn't quite as strong, but we're still kind of playing with this, because the LFP comes from a three-phase model. I've been playing around with, well, does it make sense that it should correlate strongly with oil, or do we need to add in the water and potentially the gas too in some way to make it fair, kind of a fair comparison? So we're still playing with this, but it's something that we need more work on. Okay, the other thing that we're really interested in is, can we use the NRTA to help inform our spacing decisions, our density? So what I've done is I've aggregated the oil in place calculations from the NRTA, and I've kind of normalized it up to be 1,280 acres, so a 10,000 foot lateral DSU. And I was looking to see, can I see some sort of trend with the oil in place and well spacing? And at first glance, when you kind of look at this plot, it doesn't look like there's much really there. It looks kind of scattered, but it just so happens that this particular DSU, that is this point right here, had a very, very large completion. So if you kind of ignore that point and you start looking at it, I feel like I'm starting to see, a little bit of a trend with oil in place and spacing. Again, it's still kind of early days with that. But what I like about what I'm seeing so far with actually both of these plots is that as I'm adding more wells to the analysis, I'm seeing that these trends are actually strengthening and improving. And so I think that's a really promising thing. So we still have, whatever it is, I can't do math up in front of everybody, 90 wells left to do, something like that. So hopefully as we continue to, to add wells to this data set, we're going to see that really kind of come out in the data. Okay, so some of the challenges. We've talked some about LFP. I've got some, I feel like just watching a lot of the presentations today, I've got some more ideas going back to my office how to handle some things, which is exciting. But I do feel like one of the challenges I've had, and this is just a learning curve thing, is, how do we consistently pick LFP? Because we're trying to push this analysis out across the entire basin and look for basin-wide trends, a consistent workflow is really, really important to us. So I want to make sure that as I'm going through these wells, I'm picking my LFP in a very consistent way. So as an example, here's well A. I've kind of picked the LFP here, not quite at the top, but I could have picked it there. If I look at my instantaneous plot, this gray line is the same as this gray line here, but maybe I should have picked it here. Maybe I should have picked it there. And then we got well B, sometimes you see the signature of it starting really high and then coming down. So, some LFP plots are more messy than others. I feel like has been a learning experience. I've probably touched all these 60 wells at least twice, some of them more than that, as I've learned and gone back and fixed things. But I am looking for feedback. If any of you have ideas about how you're consistently picking LFP, love to talk with you after the presentation. Because my thought is, I guess, if I'm able to better consistently pick those LFPs, is that going to help improve all the correlations that I'm looking at? I assume it will, but that's kind of an unknown there. Okay, the last challenge I wanted to talk about was relative perm. I know this has come up in a couple of presentations too. So again, I kind of have some interesting ideas going back, hearing how different people are thinking about things. The relative perm has definitely been another learning curve for me, having mostly done my work in the single phase RTA world. So having all these other knobs to turn, has been a new experience. So far, across these 60 wells, I'm seeing a variation in my NG and NOG. I'm trying to keep mostly everything else the same. And so that variation is, usually about ±1. And so I guess, again, a kind of question for the group or feedback from the group, how consistent do you think it should? Someone have a question? No? Okay. How consistent should this be across the field? What's causing the change? I've had a lot of discussions with engineers that I work with about that. Likely there's some geologic heterogeneity going on. Does it have anything to do with the amount of frac water we've pumped? And then I've also kind of observed some differences in the relative perm models that I need to fit parents versus children. So what's going on there? So there's a lot of stuff, I think, that we kind of wrap into that relative perm tuning. And again, I'd love to hear any ideas that you guys have about that. So just to wrap this up, where are we going from here? Like I've already mentioned a couple times, we're going to complete the analysis on all those 150 wells and hopefully, come to some conclusions about how we can use NRTA for density and completion optimization. We really want to prove the value to the company. Assuming all goes well with that, we then really design a consistent internal workflow and obviously can also continue collaborating with whitCon to help improve the tool and also improve our competency in it. And then consider pushing that workflow out to other basins. Right now, we've only tested it in Anadarko, and we're testing a little bit in Bakken as well. But that's my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
I have a quick question. That was an awesome workflow, really, really rigorous. In your basin, are you doing any work with finite conductivity?
Okay, the question was, are we doing any work with finite conductivity? I don't believe so. I'm not.
Okay.
Do you, Mohammed? Do you mean, are we varying fracture conductivity?
Yeah, on your FCD, are you?
Okay, yes. So sorry, I didn't understand the question right. Yes, sometimes. So a couple of the DSUs, I have had to vary the fracture conductivity. I know Matthias and I had some conversations about this, like when I've had to apply a different FCD to one well in the DSU, I generally try to keep it consistent across the DSU. But for the most part, these 60 wells, I haven't had to mess with that a whole lot. Honestly, I feel like I've had to tweak it more in my single phase modeling than in this so far, if that's helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I have a question. Very good presentation. My question is how, due to these changes in, maybe well spacing or fracture geometry, perhaps you are changing the well density across your acreage. My question is related to the change of management. How you can manage all the change of mindset to the content. How, before was using different tools, different methodology. Now you are using a new methodology which is more accurate, perhaps. But I am very interested how you are implementing this for the future.
Gotcha. So is that more around? Are you asking how we're kind of introducing this methodology to the company and how it's being received? Or
more related to change of management.
Okay, so the question is around change of management with, I guess, different methodologies being accepted within the company to move forward. I think that's kind of an ongoing thing, and in my opinion, we do have a couple of different ways that we look at drilling new wells. We kind of come at it from several different methodologies. So at this point, the single phase classical RTA is a pretty standard way of looking at the new wells, and I guess it's been for a year or two that we've been using that methodology. The NRTA hasn't been pushed out yet because, of course, we're not done with the initial analysis yet. But I mean, there's been some pushback, but I think there's also been some adoption.
If I may, like in anything, right? Like I think there always your early adopters and any way forward there. The key for us is to prove value. Like what is the value, the practicality, and then what will we bring in? Right now we have the luxury of having 3 teams evaluating this and actually putting in context of the business of the asset. So it's a little bit easier, we find, when you actually find the different stakeholders and numbers can be cool, can be applicable for actually value-adding initiatives. And that's why we have found successful for adopting any new work that we're doing.
So I get to be the champion for for some of the assets here. There's more questions, yes.
When you're doing the history matching, are you history matching well firm like by every well, or by DSU, or by formation, or what that is? Good question. So the question was, how am I applying relative perm in the history matching? Is it by well or by DSU? So it is by well, but I kind of feel like every time I go to a new DSU, that first well is kind of especially tricky. And then I start from that point with all the other wells in the DSU that I've already history matched once. And I try not to change things too terribly much. I try to just kind of tweak a couple of things and keep it kind of consistent. But that is something that I haven't really settled on as far as a consistent workflow. I've thought about, should I go back and pick like kind of an average perm model across the DSU and just apply that across the whole thing? I don't know. I haven't tried it yet, but that's something that I've thought of. Yes.
Have you guys started trying to look at the MF&B at all? Yeah.
Okay, so the question is, have we started looking at the flow material balance? Yes, that is part of the workflow that I do. I just didn't show any examples of it, but yes. Any other questions? Okay.
With that, we'll thank you. Really appreciate it. We'll take a break now, 15 minutes. We'll be back.
Yeah, so for everyone that logs in online, we'll be back here 15 past, so in 15 minutes, we'll just stay muted in the meeting. Okay, everyone, we'll get everybody seated and we'll get started again. Let us know if you can see. Excellent. Let's do this one. Okay, everyone, we'll get started again. So it's not only when you have a bunch of wells that it can be interesting to do RTA, but also when you would like to buy acreage and buy producing wells or buy companies, or you'll have no wells, or if you don't have any wells, it can be interesting to do RTA then as well. So Brian, he works for an asset-less company. Doesn't mean that they don't whatever that means. But he's a great guy. He knows a lot of you from before. Like for some reason, he says you have a spider web in the audience here from like so many different parts of the community, which is great to see. I'll let you do a quick introduction of yourself. But what we're going to talk about is how RTA has assisted basic M&A work for Rusted Natural Resources, VNR.
Thanks, Matthias. As you said, I think I'm coming from a slightly different background than a lot of the other presentations that we've had so far. That just a little bit about us, about me. That I'm the reservoir engineer. Our company is only 6 or 7 people strong. We do not have any wells. We're backed by NCAP, and just kind of we call it just asset hunting, looking at screening deals. A lot of it's been DJ Basin focused. Have touched a little bit into the Eagle Ford, into the Permian Basin. Done a little bit of Williston Basin as well, and that as we came out, the company spent 2 years during the COVID time, so it's not really quite a fair 2-year time frame, looking for assets to get in the Williston. As we switched to create a partnership with NCAP that has been a little bit more broad based to it. But during that COVID timeframe of what we really felt like has changed some of the A&D models that we're being forced with is that lack of drilling, lack of development in 2020, 2021, that now the packages, whether they're on market or off market, there's a unreasonable amount of new production with the lack of capital, lack of rig activity, lack of demand, that we went from originally being able to look at wells that had pretty stable PDP declines, overall packages, 40% decline rates for the whole in PDP. Now, 9 times out of 10, the assets we look at, they have a few wells that they were just brought online, sometimes aren't even showing any oil decline down at this point. And we felt like that's really made a challenge for us to find an asset that we can get comfortable with, NCAP can get comfortable with, and the sellers can also get comfortable with, because it just changes the whole PV metrics when you have a well that hasn't started declining yet versus a well that's already shown 2 or 3 years of decline. And hence, that's where started talking with Whitson that came through and want to start trying to do some of the RTA to supplement any kind of decline curve analysis work that we were already doing. So apologies for just kind of our simplistic overview, but we're viewing it as kind of creating a third leg to stand on, really. That always did a pretty thorough subsurface geologic modeling, always did just closology, type curve math. Combo curves been a great help to everything that we are doing. Moving that to the financial model, but where we've started inserting WITs into are a lot of those newer wells, but then also additional screening of what is our real proppant loading per foot, fluid intensity per foot, carry fluid amounts to help us have real numbers instead of a lot of it is you're looking at cum per foot, oil per foot, BOE per foot. Now we're talking about our LFPs, what kind of these newer wells that really are still in infinite acting flow, but still being able to compare a little bit more quantitatively, even though it's still on a qualitative basis, of what is their productivity amounts. Are these newer 2,500 pounds per foot, 3,000 per foot proppant loading wells really making any changes to what was 1,800, 2,000? And that just feeling like that we can be a little bit more comfortable with when we do find an asset to get. Sorry, I didn't even realize that the pages didn't work. That's what we can go. Okay. Apologies, I was just looking straight forward at the screen, and say, but that's where really that was where our thought plan was coming from, and what we really wanted to work on. So just to go straight in, just a few examples of what we were really starting to focus on was just a few grayed out production metrics, but this really has become the norm for just a straight production profile: green for oil, red for gas, blue for water, and that you can see GOR still increasing, going up to a flash point. Oil is at best being flat to maybe a decline for about 20 days or so, and that when we're coming into looking at these valuations, that they've changed their completions, they've changed their spacing, any kind of closology work can be counterintuitive, and then also the dynamics in the buyer and seller world, that they are wanting to get paid full dollar for, say, 1,000 barrel a day well, though it doesn't work the same when you have 1,000 barrel a day well decline at 85-90% versus if you have a 400 barrel a day well decline at 30%. And so that we've started using these matches, that the well in the black is not the same as the well down below, just kind of trying to capture about the matches where we're going through, where we're leaning on. Not always the best matches, because another side part that RTA generally going to want to spend months to be able to process, get comfortable with your fluid models, get comfortable with all your forecasting. We generally have 2 to 3 weeks to figure something out, get it into a financial model and go forward. So that's where talking with Matthias, that's sometimes some of our matches, and I chose this well because it's one of our probably lower quality ones, but where we're able to really take a lot from a qualitative standpoint off of our RTA work, and not always have it quantitatively dictating exactly what we're doing, but comfortable with the assumptions and the performance that we're seeing outside of that. So for us, that is the real key problem that we continue to see for. Sorry, I think I'm the only one that is not figuring out the presentation that well. So for us, just kind of the standard workflow that several people have gone through that with us just doing straight DCAs across our whole area, which is a little bit less sophisticated than some areas will be. But for almost every single well, and that's where again shout out to the Whitson group has helped us, that for every deal we're in between 10 to 30 wells loaded into Whitson and able to get generally comfort at the worst level pretty quickly, PVT bottom hole pressures with all the profiles, and then being able to step in, really start to look at, get comfortable with your material analysis and your NRTAs, and really have started to see a lot of the variations as picking the right LFP, how that can really dictate the early time performance for all these wells, and that's leaning on older wells that have 3-4 years of production history within 1 or 2 miles from some of the newer wells that are showing no signs of some transition of infinite acting versus transitional flows, to start being a little more comfortable on how to go outward and forward. So that will create a lot of these tables. That's all dummy numbers added up to about increased by about 10-15% on a few of them. But we've just started just drilling into each specific number as we're assigning value to every single PV well across all of our assets. That generally, that's if a purchase or a transaction is consummated, that will be responsible on every single one of those wells forecast, and so trying to be comfortable as a whole and then also as a small piece to it. And so the 2 examples I just kind of wanted to work through where the RTA and Whitson workflow is absolutely critical. First one was on an oil one, very similar to the rate time plot that was earlier in the presentation. Just for this table, I apologize, I did try and look at arrows or graphs, so it's not just numbers flowing across the table, but just I couldn't get any takeaways from it overall, so just kind of wanted to leave you with what our takeaways were for these DSUs. On the oil one, it was a pretty tight DSU. The wells only had about 8 months of production, but again, less than 30 days of production decline. And that you saw significant differences. I wish the operator could have been a little more helpful. Across the board, they varied their spacing, not only inner zone, but also top and bottom, changing exactly how they wine rack their wells, had various lateral lengths, and also actually changed the proppant loading by about 10% across the wells also. So that was where there are so many different variables changing across the board, but this is where almost all of the PDP value, 95% of this value transaction was across this 1 mile area, and that some of the wells on this right side were extra higher spacing. Wells on the west side were actually slightly higher reservoir quality, but then also tighter spacing and differences. And then we had 1 parent well that we were able to anchor everything off of and to see our changes to there. So our main takeaways were that there's clear parent-child degradation, that parent well was a 2x performer, and that's where we did RTA at all of these. They got really strong matches on this parent well. It gave us confidence to be able to use a lot of the inputs on the other wells and to speed up the process for those wells. But every single infill well on a real production basis is half of what the parent well was, and that the drawdown rates that the wells went down to were twice as fast as the original parent well. So you can see that reservoir depletion, even though it wasn't through all your secondary fluids, that still GORs were pretty similar, still pretty slow to climb and flash to those. And that our key takeaways were that the wider spacing wells to the east, even though it's slightly lower reservoir quality, was the best performing wells that gave us the most confidence in our DCA fits. The tighter wells seemed like that they would decline at a higher rate, and that our numerical model going forward also supported that as well. So not as more of a qualitative assertion that we took away from what we saw in the early time performance, and then also just on the modeling going forward. And then on the gas example, going a much wider area, 15 miles east to west, losing about 2,000 feet on a TBD basis. But on the exact opposite, with the exception of pressure, every other reservoir characteristic is improving across that area. So you're seeing a lot higher thickness, higher OGIP calculations, and that the problem was that the density development was only done in the deeper area to essentially just have the higher rates and just less, kind of less risk on the initial well deliverability. So all the private companies generally are IP chasing and then also just trying to deliver the returns quickly. So when we went through there and was able to match across the board, east to west, and then incorporate choke managed or non-choke managed, that without the Whitson tool with the LFP kind of work, that we wouldn't have been able to have enough sample size to even evaluate the whole area. That we were able across that 15-mile area for the various choke managed, non-choke managed wells to get comfort level for the degrees of drawdown shown at the different wells, with that combination of some wells less than a year old, some wells 4 years old, and then varying completions from 1,000 pounds per foot up to about 2,500 pounds per foot. And that's so the takeaway to that was that there's severe well performance degradation as we lost that pressure. Even though we increased that OGIP, our recovery factors were decreasing substantially, and that in the end we kind of picked up, hate to say, like a line of death, really, that we just couldn't ascribe value to on the northwest side at today's commodity prices, which at a different time, capital costs could come down a little bit, or that commodity prices might be a little bit more in line with CapEx costs, that there's definitely a quality reservoir there. But in the model we were looking at that effective date, the wells just were not quite economically able to drive a full asset development plan there. And unfortunately, in the end, why we're still assetless is we ascribed no value to that area, but walked away feeling comfortable to that because there's definitely buyer's remorse to it all. And really just kind of our takeaways were that the team that I'm on, a lot of us have spent a lot of time not inside the private equity investing world to it, but it's something that we've all kind of felt passionate about over the last couple of years to try and jump into and go headfirst into it. And that was part of what I wanted to try and bring to the table for our team, was to try and think about it a little bit differently than just drawing type curve areas, and try and use some of these new technologies coming out, and that Whitson's changed so much from using Fiquette back 10, 15 years ago. This speed that you can analyze wells that complements an A&D, M&A kind of timeline and process, I think rather well, as long as you're not looking for the definitive output answer that you can bang the table on, but you're looking for qualitative indications to get you a little more comfortable on your subsurface, your DCA work, and your typology kind of work, that it can definitely add an extra leg to your stool and help get across the table with management, with your investors, and then even hopefully bridge a buyer-seller gap as well. And that is all I have. Oh, okay, I got it. Easy. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you have a sense for like the typical delta between kind of the physics-based forecast and sell-side forecast, percentage-wise?
So we're usually actually within about 5% as long as we have say 9 to 12 months of production. Sorry, I forgot to repeat the question. Do we have a sense of the delta between physics-based forecast and rate time forecast? And a lot of the times we're anywhere from about that 10% range that when you have enough time that with the numerical model, you can get comfort level there. The problem that we've seen some wide variances to is when the flow conditions have been varied quite a bit. Some of those earlier wells that you only had that 20-day decline, we did see 25-30% variances off that. And our normal workflow is to do the DCA and then do the physics-based, then come back and see if we think we're missing anything and does that support it or not. And it's definitely that gap shrinks the more production history that you have, as you would expect.
So, PE backbone in there, are you finding that this type of approach to A&D type work is well received by your equity backer, or are they happy with just decline curve analysis? You know what I'm getting at? So I think I know how you're using it. You're using it more as a validation, right? You do your initial DCA, you have your backup, and then you want to validate the type curves that they've given you to, again, make sure not overstating a bunch. So that's why I'm just kind of curious, are they receptive to it? Or are they just happy with what they've got?
Yeah. So the question is, are the PE backers receptive to the RTA type workflows in our conversations as we're working with them to come to our kind of final analysis answer? And yes, I think they've been very supportive of it. That NCAP, like a lot of the private equity sponsors, do have a full technical team. They've got 3 engineers that are very smart, very good backgrounds, and they've all been exposed to this kind of workflows in one way or another. So that it almost sometimes sends us down a rabbit hole sometimes, and that we can't go across because we usually have an hour to talk with them, and that sometimes the conversation can get away from us and we have to focus on looking at our plan. But what's really helped is those times like that one well example that we had very little production history, that they would have just wanted to risk it by 30% and just be very pessimistic, though we felt like productivity was higher than what you'd seen in immediate other offset wells, so that we felt like we got a little extra value and they were comfortable underwriting that with us. Yeah, so I think it's been great. It's just an extra conversation point to have when the meetings with them.
I've done a lot on the A&D side, so kind of looking at the higher perspective, and kind of walking in these data rooms and kind of see how they laid it out, not only their PPs, but also the undeveloped pieces on there, taking into account, certain, whatever it's EUR per foot, certain spacing, all that kind of stuff. And I've been burned a lot of times, lots of these things, where they have a very specific area where everything looks like it's great, and they apply across the board. And you use this evolve to kind of step back and look at whole areas and say, okay, what's the right spacing, what's the right well size for these undeveloped bases from like the existing PPs and some of this
The question is, as we've gone in and looked at assets, a lot of the time someone will focus on just one area that has the most wells drilled, the best performance, and how do we expand out to other areas that might not have as strong of a reservoir area or as much performance area. And that's generally one of the starting points that we do when we huddle together with our technical team, that we acknowledge we have a finite time frame to it, and then we do a quick scope of the data of what's in the VDR. And it's, do we want to focus on where the high value upside wells are that we're going to pay for and ascribe value to, and then also, are there areas outside that our geologist finds very interesting and that we need to try and do as much work as we can. So we've done a little bit of both. A lot of it is trying to find out how to maximize our undeveloped NAV value to justify a more aggressive bid. So we've actually, I'd say, spent the most work going on peripheral areas to see if we can support, because that's where the most locations are, and that's what's going to differentiate you from a higher bid or lower bid of, can I increase 100 locations by 10% or 10 locations by 20%? So we usually try and go for the bigger bang for the buck. And that is where, as long as there's enough production history, it's incredibly helpful to help benchmark and then move out from that core area that might have better reservoir properties to that weaker area that does not. Just in that gas example that I showed, it just unfortunately showed the exact opposite of what we were hoping for. And that's why we had that example, is that was the goal and thought that was going to be the key to the transaction.
Very good. Thank you so much, Brian.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. We have 2 more presentations coming on.
Sorry about if there was any issues with the actual PowerPoint. It's probably my fault, most likely.
Probably my fault. I didn't ask how to use it first.
Yeah, exactly.
Started changing the conversation.
No worries. I mean, it's fun to see, and I guess the question here on using this kind of work in that space is also a little bit dependent on your backer as well. We work with, some of them are smaller and bigger in the PE space, like Meridev is probably one of the bigger PE-backed NCAP players we work with, which is also in the consortium and everything. And I guess you guys are NCAP-backed as well, yeah. So super interesting. Next up, we're actually going to do a virtual presentation. So Jaren, can you just let us know if you're there?
Yeah, you betcha. Can you hear me?
Oh, the sound is perfect, man.
Oh,
I'll
excellent.
stop sharing here, and then you'll. There we go. We can see it very soon. And first time I read your title, I thought it said transitional flow. How low can you go? but it was not that. So that's probably for the flight thing later.
Yeah, that was like V1 of the title, but then I was like, that doesn't make any sense. So
yeah, excellent. So the sounds perfect here. I'll get back to my seat, and the floor is all yours.
Great, excellent. Thanks, Matthias. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jaren Van Dyken. I'm a reservoir engineer in the Kaybob Duvernay asset for Crescent Point Energy up here in Calgary. Just here to share with you some of my experiences using numerical RTA and fractional RTA on our wells. Just a quick overview of the agenda here. So yeah, I got a couple slides just to introduce the Duvernay, and then some examples using numerical RTA on some of our recent wells and kind of the puzzles I've been trying to solve after doing that. One of the things that's helped quite a bit has been using the fractional RTA technique. So I'll show you how that adds some insight. It's kind of complementary to interpreting the numerical RTA plots. And then, yeah, I'll just kind of give a summary of the delta distributions that I've got from using the fractional RTA and the potential implications that are there for, fine tuning our DCA forecasts and that kind of thing. I've also got one slide where I've interpreted a reservoir simulation. So if you've got time for that, I'll touch on that quickly too, and then just kind of summarize conclusions and next steps. All right, so for anybody that's not familiar with the Duvernay, it's a multi-phase unconventional play in the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin. It's very laterally extensive with a few key development areas. Kaybob is the main one, largely because it's the most overpressured and the highest liquids content. Most of the acreage is in a volatile oil or retrograde condensate fluid window. And Crescent Point established its position here about a year and a half ago when they bought a bunch of acreage from Shell. So we started working with the Whitson tools shortly thereafter, primarily for the equation of state model that they built for the Duvernay and helping us with our PVT and fluid properties. And then, yeah, benefited from being part of the JIP and all of the RTA techniques that have been added to the platform since then. So yeah, I mentioned our starting point was basically on fluid properties with using the Whitson tools. This is an example where I've just mapped fluid viscosity, so it shows how viscosity decreases from like starting in the north with a high fluid viscosity for black oil areas, and then lightening up as we go further south where there's a lot more gas. I think I showed this map and maybe a few others in the March session, so you might recognize some of this. But yeah, if we just throw a bunch of phase diagrams on here, you also see that most of this is multi-phase, and so historically, RTA has not been much of a reliable tool for us because of the changing GOR and changing compressibility. So yeah, like I said, the development of the RTA techniques, like the numerical RTA and fractional RTA in the whitCon platform, has been quite valuable for us, and just gonna show you some examples of that. So I've been applying these techniques to several of our recent wells, basically to compare the linear flow parameters and the contacted oil in place at a pad level, and ultimately to do the same thing that I think a lot of you folks are doing, to dial in things like proppant intensity, fluid intensity, well spacing, these kinds of things, but ultimately using very simple numbers like these to compare things at a pad level in order to help us make those decisions. The challenge with analyzing recent wells, and I've been mostly focused on recent wells because we think we're pretty close to an optimal solution with our development plan. So we're not interested in completely changing the game, mostly just doing fine tuning. And so our recent wells are probably quite representative of what we're going to do going forward. But the challenge with analyzing recent wells is that you may not be through transition to boundary dominated flow yet. And when you're not through the transition yet, it's really hard to tell when you're going to be in boundary dominated flow, because you really need a sufficient trend to convince you of that, and that it's not just a short-term aberration, for example. So the upshot of this is that the uncertainty on contacted oil in place is high. So depending on whether you treat a well like it's in boundary dominated flow or not, has big implications on contacted oil in place and therefore EUR. So in this example, I've analyzed the same well at 2 points in time. The only difference in the data is that interpretation number 2 has 2 more months of production, but remarkably, has quite that 2 months of production had quite an impact on the interpretation. So the first time I looked at this well, I just analyzed a bunch of wells that were all clearly still in linear flow, or certainly not in boundary dominated flow. So I was quite excited to identify this one that looked like it was in boundary dominated flow. But when I made the LFP pick and the oil in place pick here in interpretation number 1, I was surprised to see that I got quite a low oil in place estimate, and correspondingly a low EUR estimate. So that was first pass. Definitely flagged this one as one to keep an eye on going forward. And then sure enough, 2 months later, take another look, and it's actually jumped up on that instantaneous LFP plot and returned to a previous plateau. And now it's exhibiting behavior that kind of suggests it's still in linear flow, or certainly not in boundary dominated flow. Now with the new LFP pick and oil in place estimate, I ended up with a much higher EUR, so about 40% higher than the original one, and definitely something that looked a little more in line with what I was expecting. So I like this example because it shows the danger of being overconfident in your interpretation too early and the implications of that. So the next step is to look at some older wells to better understand what that transition to boundary dominated flow looks like for our wells and how to best identify it. But then at the same time, as I was kind of wrestling with some of these interpretations, is when the fractional RTA technique became available in the whitCon platform. So I started to employing that at the same time as starting to look at some older wells in hope that maybe collectively the two methods can paint a clear picture about how our wells go from infinite acting flow to boundary dominated flow and the timing of that. So I've completed analysis on around 40 of our Duvernay wells. I'll just show you a small handful of those. Some of them reach boundary dominated flow quite quickly. Others take a lot longer. So you can see what that looks like on both the diagnostic plots, and I'll show you kind of a distribution of that later on as well. So we'll start with just this same example, but just adding the fractional RTA analysis. So we recall we were struggling with whether this is in linear or boundary dominated flow. From the fractional RTA plot, we get a delta value of 0.35. So, quick recap, 0 is boundary dominated flow, 0.5 is infinite acting flow. So 0.35 is somewhere in the middle. So we're in a type of transitional flow, but basically a bit closer to linear flow than to boundary dominated flow. And even just having this extra plot at hand is already quite enabling in understanding what a flat profile in the Bowie diagnostic plot is showing us. Because in this case, we have a well that looks like it's been in a type of transitional flow for the majority of its production history. And so the conclusion is that we're certainly not in boundary dominated flow. And going forward, we just need to be patient, watch that delta parameter come down in the fractional RTA plot. And then at that point, we can start increasing our confidence in the oil in place estimate and the corresponding EUR. So let's just check out a few more quick examples. This one shows another common challenge with interpreting Duvernay wells, which is a very large initial peak on the diagnostic plot, followed by a long and stable plateau. Now, the question is whether the flat profile here in the diagnostic plot represents infinite acting or whether it's a type of transitional flow. And what we see again in the fractional RTA plot is that this one is also kind of right in the middle when it comes to that delta parameter on the fractional plot. So indeed, it's in transitional flow and has been for most of its production history. The interesting part on this one is that the delta parameter is a fair bit lower than that of the previous one. And this well's been producing for basically exactly the same time as the other one, but in a different area of the field and with a different completion design. So this is where we can probably say something about the frac network uniformity, where this one has benefited for a more efficient stimulation, and that also shows up with the higher LFP pick as well. All right, moving on. So here is another well with a very sharp initial peak followed by a long plateau with plenty of bumps, or let's call them head fakes along the way. So you can imagine if you analyze this well at certain times in its production history, you may come to the conclusion it's reached boundary dominated flow. But here we are, 5 years into production, and looking at that instantaneous LFP plot, the LFP value is about as high as it's ever been. So on one hand, this is a little bit puzzling, but on the other hand, it's not necessarily disappointing because typically the longer you're in a transitional flow period like this, the more it tends to elevate your contacted oil in place estimate. So on one hand, you want to be, you're eager to get an estimate on that oil in place and nail that down. But on the other hand, it's like the more that remains uncertain, the higher your contacted oil in place estimate will likely end up being. So patience is a virtue, as they say. But when we look at the fractional RTA plot, in this case, we certainly see that this well is much closer to boundary dominated flow than the previous two that we just looked at. And so we can probably expect to see a gradual and consistent decline in the numerical RTA plot likely soon. All right, a couple more to go here. This is probably my best example of a well that transitions to boundary dominated flow quickly and has been there for quite some time. So yeah, I don't think anybody would say this one has a possibility of coming back. It's firmly in boundary dominated flow. It's got a very nice gradual decline in the numerical RTA diagnostic plot, and it's also very consistent with the neighboring numerical models in shape, but also when looking at the fractional plot, we have a delta value very close to 0. So it all goes around. This is a fully bounded well that we drilled quite some time ago at quite tight well spacing. So out of all the examples, it makes sense that this one transitions to boundary dominated flow the quickest, and that all makes sense. So finally, last example here to wrap things up, and in being consistent with the title of my presentation, I have another example of a well that's been in a type of transitional flow for a very long time. So this well's been producing for nearly 7 years and certainly appears to be more like boundary dominated flow than infinite acting flow. But nevertheless, on the LFP plot, we have still quite an elevated profile and not a decline. So I would say, judging from that, this one still has legs, even though it's one of the oldest wells in the field. So we'll see if this one, or when this one, starts to consistently decline. But for now, it's still maintaining quite a nice plateau there, albeit in a type of transitional flow as seen in the fractional plot. So. Okay, quickly, just wanted to give you a sense of the distribution of delta values I've seen after analyzing 40 of our wells. So this plot shows everything at a pad level. So pad average, some of these have, 2 wells, some of them have, 5 wells. So, but really that's when we're using these techniques and comparing LFPs, oil in place, delta values, I find comparing things at a pad level is quite useful. And you can see some pads are still very much in infinite acting flow. Others are very much in boundary dominated flow and everything in between. So yeah, no big surprises there. If we plot the same results but at a well level and then sort them by their delta value and color by vintage, so blue wells are very recent wells, red wells are older wells. We see that generally the older wells are closer to boundary dominated flow, the newer wells are closer to infinite acting flow, and that is all perfectly to be expected. Although you see there's some exceptions in there, and it's not quite black and white or red and blue. It's not quite that simple. So there does seem to be some influence coming from things like well spacing, completion intensity, etc. And those are things we're going to dig a little deeper on and investigate further going forward. Okay, real quick, just wanted to show one more example on this one. Instead of looking at field data, looking at it from a slightly different perspective here. So what I've done is plugged in the results of a ResFrac simulation to see if it also suggests a significant period of transitional flow. And without spending too much time on it, and I recognize this isn't a perfect match. This is kind of a quick look, but I think it tells us a fairly consistent story. So I would say it does point to the same conclusion that the first 10 to 12 years or so are largely dominated by a type of transitional flow where the instantaneous LFP plot it goes up and down until a certain point where it reaches a steady decline and exhibits boundary dominated flow. So, again, this is a quick look. One example, this is at fairly wide spacing. So we're interested to plug in some other simulation results and see how that time to boundary dominated flow changes with different spacing, different completion intensity, and if we can line that up with what we're seeing in the field data as well. All right, so in conclusion, I've analyzed about 40 Duvernay wells using these numerical and fractional RTA techniques. We have a wide range in these key diagnostic parameters, LFPs, oil in place, delta values. I started by showing you some of the key challenges with interpreting these wells using these techniques, and how some wells take many years to stabilize and are in transitional flow for quite some time, and some actually reach boundary dominated flow quite quickly. So we're interested in analyzing our full population of wells. That's somewhere around 250 wells, and then using the results from these techniques along with things like I mentioned, well spacing, completion intensity, to see if we can bucket things and use the delta values and corresponding B factors to refine our DCA forecasts accordingly. So yeah, I think that I'll leave it there and take any questions.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Jaron. Really good. We have some questions from the audience here, so they'll ask it to me, and then I'll just repeat it to you, Jaron, before you answer, okay?
Sounds good.
Sounds good. Naji?
Yes, Naji. We're talking about the delta in the transition region. Is there any attempt to do the rate of change of delta as a function of time and come up with a relationship? So that would be a very powerful tool to kind of predict the performance. Each time the data comes in, delta changes. Is it a stepwise change or is it continuous change? That's
So Nadia's question is about kind of because delta can change over time, right? And I think some of your diagnostic plots there also show that maybe initially there's a delta of 0.5 and then it kind of goes and follows a delta of 0.3 for a very, very long time, and then maybe for the boundary well it reached maybe 0 at some point in time there. And I guess maybe the question was more to us at whitSun whether we will implement how to do that or track that over time. It's actually very easy in the interface now to just change the delta and you can like visually see it, but being able to maybe add multiple slopes over time in the plot itself with like different distinct deltas be super helpful, or try to almost like you can do in a decline world, you can calculate the B factor almost on a daily basis by derivatives, etc. You can probably do something similar with this. So I'll add it to the implementation backlog, but definitely something on our roadmap.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, like most of what I've been doing is using that fractional RTA diagnostic plot to help me interpret the numerical RTA. And so I'm mostly just looking at the most recent delta value and kind of using the filtering tool to circle the most recent data and understand where the well is currently. But definitely recognize that in a lot of cases we see changes along the way and it stabilizes at different points depending on where it is in its history. So yeah, something I'm interested in looking at in more detail as well.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yep.
Okay, hi. Just want to know what is the perforation cluster spacing and also the permeability of the reservoir?
Yeah, so permeability, if you measure it at the core level, is on like tens of nanodarcies. At the defit level, it's like low hundreds, 150 nanodarcies, that kind of thing. So, so that, yeah, kind of 10 to 150 would be your range likely. And then cluster spacing varies, of course, but we're currently somewhere around the range of 8-meter cluster spacing, something like that.
8 meter, that's like 30 feet.
Yeah, translate for us.
I need to translate. That's excellent.
A little bit less. Yeah, you bet.
Perfect. Was there another question here or? Yeah. Really good. Actually, thank you so much, Sharon. Really good presentation. Thanks for sharing all of this. I know some of the work here was also very recent with the fractional RTA piece, so it was cool to see that as well. And just for like a little bit of historical context, I don't know if anyone knows my good friend John Thompson. He worked in Phuket way back, and he always tells his story about how Craig, which is the next speaker, did exactly what Jaron did now, took like a very complex kind of a la ResFrac model, employed it into RTA and just showed everybody this doesn't make sense at all. so I'm glad that we can kind of wrap up at least the presentation part of today with the talk from Craig, and I think that will it's not necessarily directly related to RTA, but how that will implicate or has implications on our analysis in general. So with that introduction, Craig, I'll just launch. Hello, Brian, are you ready to share?
Yeah, I'm ready to share. Just give me a second.
Excellent. So we should be in good shape then. There we go. And I'm pretty sure we are full screen already, so that's good. Excellent. Perfect. So for this is the last thing of the official program. What we're going to do after this is that food will be served, and we're going to do the panel while we eat. But the people that's in the panel, which is Bruce, Claudia, Stephen, who am I missing? Gustavo. So they'll take food first, and then we'll just line up after it, and then we'll start the panel while we eat. I think that'll be a good thing. And then we'll hopefully hear a few horror stories or war stories from Bruce. He has many. So in this session, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to take the same well. It's a public well in SB data repository. We'll have 3 different people interpreting the same data set. And then I'll just summarize kind of the key takeaways from the different data sets when we get there. Right now, Brian, we see your presenter view, I think.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So first it will be Brian, and then we'll do Jason, and he'll do here in person, and then Brayden in person as well. And the sound is also.
Still presenter view.
Now I don't see, let's see here.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I think I left the meeting.
Oh, you left the meeting? No. Yeah,
Oh, you're here.
No, but I think he uses a phone for the camera,
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So left it on. It's a typical thing that I do all the time. I do the phone and the meeting on Teams. It's like double tap, but that's good.
I'm trying to come back in. No, I'm still in it. Okay, let's try this again.
There we go. Excellent.
Okay. Sorry about
that. Just before Brian starting, so it's one of the SPE data repository wells. So everybody in this room can actually go in and do exactly the same work. The only thing for a little bit of background is that because we did something similar with SPE earlier this year. I don't know if some of you were in that session, but that session became a little bit messy because all the interpreters, they use different PVT, they use different bottom hole pressures, they did use different abandonment pressures. So there's no real true apple-to-apple type of comparison. So we wanted to constrain it a little bit here. So the PVT is the same, the final abandonment pressure is the same, and also a little bit of the fluid initialization is the same. So we try to keep that consistent. But also we wanted all the interpreters to report the same things, which is like their best estimate EUR predictions and also the contacted oil in place predictions for that. I've seen all the presentations individually, but I have not asked anyone to change anything about their interpretations. So this is literally 3 people that just sees a data set totally in the blind and they're trying to do kind of their best job with the tools they have available. So with that, Brian, I'll leave you first to it, and I'll mute myself.
Okay. Thanks for letting me participate in this. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to be there in person. I'm traveling tomorrow, and my wife would have been displeased if I had tried to make it back tonight. And then also, Matthias, thanks for uploading all the data for this so I could just jump right in and do the interpretations. Okay. So the way that I typically go through my workflow in RTA is just to first enter all the well data, which I said I didn't have to do, and then I'll go right into numerical RTA. I like to run everything at the default settings and see what happens, and that's what you're seeing here is the results of just running the well at all these settings here, which are just the defaults. It all ended up looking pretty good once I calibrated the linear flow parameter on a relative basis compared to what I'm used to seeing, which is in low fracture conductivity environments. That was not the case here. I've got an infinite fracture conductivity apparently. And while this does look pretty close, I didn't exactly like this shape on the Bowie plot. And then I didn't like this early time kind of lack of conformity to the shapes of those lines. Otherwise, I went ahead and ran the model. It's a pretty decent fit. I'm usually okay with the bottom hole pressure being that close, although of course you'd like it to be closer. And then we, as a group, talked about we weren't going to change any of the initial water saturation numbers or anything. So I essentially just ignored actually both water and gas in this simulation. But running on a gas constraint, pretty close match here. The resultant EUR, 10,000 day EUR is 250 MBO, which did feel a little small to me right off the bat. The next step in my workflow typically is to go look at how that numerical RTA lines up with just standard decline curve analysis. Luckily, I didn't have to do anything constrain the B factor to any certain range. I just let this thing auto fit, and it gave me a B factor that I'm pretty, I guess, disposed toward believing, right around 1. So the 10,000 day EUR here that said 338 MBO kind of gave me a little bit of a pause and said, man, I don't know if I'm fully believing the numerical RTA answer right now. Next step from there for me in this particular case was to go to flowing material balance. This isn't typically something that I use very much, again, because of the low fracture conductivity. I end up having wells that appear to be in some sort of linear flow or transitional flow for a long time. And I personally haven't found the flowing material balance to be very useful in those situations. However, here it did seem like it came up at least with a good minimum number. I essentially set the slope to match when this flowing, or when the bottom hole pressure and the reservoir pressure meet right here during this little build-up period. And that looks like it corresponds pretty closely with the slope of the early time. So I find this interpretation to be pretty believable, again, at about 420,000 barrels. So now I'm starting to get a little bit concerned that I was going to have trouble figuring out how to come up with a final answer here to compare to everybody else. So I went back to RTA because that's kind of been my baseline, is to believe the answers that I get here ultimately. So what I did is started playing around with the rel perm to see if I could get a better fit on the cumulative GOR curve here. Didn't seem to do very much. I also obviously didn't change the default numbers very much either, but I didn't know anything about the formation or the well where it was, so I didn't want to change it too much. The other thing I did is kind of recalled some recent experience that I've had using the matrix gamma property. And when I have trouble matching very early time data on the Bowie diagnostic plot with the rest of the well, I've started playing around with that, and sure enough, here it actually did help me get quite a bit more believable shape of the Bowie plot, or the shape of the actual versus the Bowie plot, and the same thing with the cum oil. So going forward into the simulation, the oil EUR now with just those couple of changes ends up being about 415 MBO compared to 420 from the flowing material balance. So in this case, I probably would ignore, or not ignore, but look at the DCA as a low case, and then probably feel pretty good about being right around 420,000 barrels total. That's it for me.
Perfect, Brian. And everyone doesn't have to necessarily remember all the different cases, because I'll go through and summarize everything there. But really appreciate it, Brian. So
Yep.
Short, a couple of passes there.
How much productive time was there on that well?
It was like 350 days, I believe. Well, productive time. There was a shut-in period, so it was a little less than that.
Yeah. And we'll get back to that, like why we picked the well, why we wanted to pick a challenging well, because that's always more fun. We can't keep it easy. That's not fun. If everybody agrees, so there's no need to have these things. I'll go ahead and share again. And if you can just let me know if you see the screen again, Brian, when you do here. You see it now?
Yes, I see it.
Perfect. We'll give it over to Jason.
Same thing. All right, so now yeah, we get the new chord colors for this one. So you get both the old and the new here. So yeah, same well. Interesting. I actually I start with the flowing material balance. You might have noticed from the last presentation, I'm a pretty big fanboy of the flowing material balance. It feels like it gives me the anyway. So just interesting. I actually start with this matching the kind of early time data. Sort of, maybe it's because I'm from the Bakken and most of the wells I look at the Bakken, but kind of before the GOR takes off. So I just feel like that gives me a pretty decent starting place as far as original contacted volumes. And again, I basically sort of look for
this kind of signature, where is it flat early time before it starts taking off, and then just making sure. I really like this plot because you have that, and then also you have some kind of bounds on your pressure. So if you screw it up too much, if your flowing bottom hole pressures are higher than your reservoir pressure, that's sort of bad, and that kind of hinges you in. It sort of limits the possibilities a little bit. Also, like this has no rel perm. Just anyway, lots of things I like about this. But that's kind of how I started off. I used the W&G correlation only basically because it was in the middle. Obviously, if you had other data to tell you to use another correlation, do that, but didn't have that. So, but I got like about 1486 on the original contacted oil there. So, and then I go into numerical RTA. So yeah, I didn't see that anyway at the beginning. One thing is I saw when I did this anyway, I saw that I was kind of getting this higher, and maybe I should have brought it up there. But anyway, I thought that maybe the reservoir pressure was a little too low, and that would have brought that down a little bit. But basically, again, I lean on the flowing material balance a little more and stuff, and so kind of like, okay, my flowing material balance about 1400. Not that, can I get a reasonable match between those two is basically what I was trying to do here. And so the one I'm kind of matching here is about 1410 stem, and then basically the oil was lining up pretty well on that too, except in early time. And then I basically adjusted the rel perms to sort of get a questionable. I don't know if I can get the pointer up here, but I'm basically looking for, am I ending time about right on the cum gas? This is cum gas here, and this is the GOR, and it's okay. It's not great, but I could probably mess around with the rel perms a little longer and maybe get a slightly better. But basically that's the gas match, and then not sure on the oil, but like everybody else, like you're not going to rel perm your way into a water match on this. It had to be something materially, either your SW is way off, or we need to add in a layer because we're fracking into a water wet layer or whatever. You weren't going to get it with the default values by any means. And then this is the numerical model results. So I guess, some of my perspective, again, hadn't worked, well, I worked at Eagle Ford about a decade ago, and just for very technical things. So it's been a while. And so I don't have a whole lot of background in Eagle Ford, but in general, my modeling approach is, start out as simple as you can. One perm. I didn't use enhanced fracture regions. Didn't use any kind of matrix or the pressure dependent perm. Just start with as simple as you can, and then sort of work it from there. So that's what I started with, and pretty much what I ended up with. I did some slight adjustments from the perm XF and frac count that's coming from the numerical RTA, but nothing significant. And using gas control on this. Some critiques of it is, would have played a little. I'd rather have my flowing bottom hole pressure match out, especially as I'm going out of history a little closer. What I found was I could either make, sort of get this real close and this would be off, or vice versa. So I just kind of landed in the middle. I justified that a little bit just because after the shut-in, looked like, especially on the gas, since I'm using that as control, it's kind of flopping around quite a bit. And so I thought that was, affecting my match there a little bit. But anyway, a decent match. Got like 400 EUR on, again, for that 10,000 day EUR. So when he said 250 earlier, I was like, oh, damn, did I get really wrong? Maybe I shouldn't show mine. So anyway, I was glad he came back with something in the ballpark. The only other thing highlighted was like almost 28% recovery factor. My management wouldn't like that and stuff, and I could again mess with the rel perms a little bit and get that down to 24. But anyway, that'd be another thing. If I had more time, I'd probably look into a little more. But that seems a little high. But yeah, anyway, that was the other thing I noted. And similar to the previous guy, whether we like it or not, DCA is a line in the sand. Typically, my company already has a expected EUR from decline, so I'm always comparing back to that versus, and here when I did the decline, again, a BO1, simpler, I'm getting 373, so I'm within 10%, and that's just a good check that I normally do, or yeah, management's going to ask anyway. And so, yeah, I typically always do that kind of check as well. And if it's vastly different, usually I have definitely have an explanation for it if you're way different from DCA. And then, yeah, I was just going to highlight too, like this is just one well, but obviously I find the power in RTA and the simulations is the comparison between multiple wells. So keep your modeling approach consistent. Again, don't jump, oh, well, this one has, enhanced fractured regions, this one doesn't, keep all those the same. And, I think the power is then compare, okay, I'm only changing the knobs, I'm keeping the rail perm the same, I'm keeping the modeling approach the same, then what do I have to, what's the differences between those multiple wells? Anyway, that's kind of, and yeah, so I think I went over, so yeah, 403 is what I got, so not too far, good.
Very good, very good. Last man out here is Braden. And then I'll do a quick summary just to compare. And floor is yours.
Sounds good. So I was a little worried. It's been a little while since I was asked to show my work on something. So following through, as Matthias said, we had a bunch of constraints that we were given, and then some flexibility for rel perm LFP OP sort of things. And then just asked to kind of walk through what our mental model was as we walk through. So kind of starting with the raw data, things that I usually look for is what is the GOR doing? So as we go through bubble point, you expect the GOR to rise. If you see a GOR that's kind of ramping after that, to me, that's boundary dominated flow. If you're seeing a GOR kind of flat, that would be infinite acting. So that's kind of geared up for me. It was pretty flat after there, so I was thinking infinite acting. I don't know if the buildup was too much here, given that I think it was calculated from surface. But generally looking to see if that buildup snapping up. To me, that's low FCD. If it's kind of a lazy buildup, then maybe not a low FCD. And then just trying to see, like when we see a change in pressure, are we seeing a corresponding change in rates? We have some wells where for whatever reason our calculated pressure drops or the rates drop, but you don't see it on the pressure or the rates. And then to me, that's just, that link is always going to be questionable because the numerical RTA is going to say, okay, given that pressure profile, what's the rates? And if you don't see that tying, you know that it's going to be bad. You didn't see a lot of step changes here, so it's hard to see, but it looked reasonable quality, so I'll call that okay. I did do the smoothing of the pressure since with the numerical RTA, it is taking that pressure profile. So if you have noise there, it's going to translate to noise later on. So I really like that feature for Whitson for sure. This was kind of the default rel perm match and how it looked for me. It looked okay for oil. As the other two mentioned, water was just so far off that I was like, I don't think with an SW of 30%, I'm ever going to get there. So my kind of notes were I would definitely need more water. Needed a higher GOR. You could see the GOR was definitely way off. And the oil shape didn't look too bad, so I didn't want to alter rel perm a ton on that side. What I ended up doing, and I kind of always, the cume plots hold a lot of weight for me because thinking about from the value side, if we're not off on the cume basis and trying to compare wells, it's not going to be good kind of when we come to the economic state. So I only thought I could move NW down to about 1.5 for water. And again, at the SW 0.3, for me, I would generally say there must be a problem on the petrophysical side, or it's frac water and I will need longer history. But I would go back to the geo and say, if we're going to have a sustained water cut of 40, 50%, be sure the SW is only 30 for at least the fields I work. I push SG to 0%, and that's maybe just a Bradenism, but I typically don't see where the GOR kind of flattens as you're getting that, trying to build up that critical gas saturation. Plus I needed a bit more GOR, and then tuned up NG down and NOG up to just try to get more GOR for that mole. So that's a quick pass on the rel perm side to try to get what I thought was a better looking, but still definitely not pretty match. I tried to use the instantaneous LFP plot a bit more. It was still pretty wavy and noisy, and even after changing the moving average, didn't really make it nicer for me, so I kind of moved away from that, but I have another kind of look at that later. When I did my numerical model match, as you could see, this is on pressure constraint, and I'm mainly looking at oil and gas. And the cumes aren't awesome for sure. So I wasn't super happy with this, but it was okay. If I was going to show this to management, I would probably toggle it to gas constraint because it's always a prettier match to show off for sure. But one of the things I like to do too is to say, if you're off a little bit, like what would happen if you added 30% to the OUP, maybe tweak the LFP, can you still get a good match? So this is the kind of the same inputs for rel perm and everything, but just adding 30% to the OUP, tweaking around a bit. And it's not quite as good, but it's not terribly far off. So to me, it would be hard to say that you really like that first OUP, when in this case, I think that the quality was just, I wasn't going to get a match that I felt really confident with. And I do the same thing going down. So this is with a OUP 30% smaller. And again, you could see the Q matches, like if an engineer came in with this, you wouldn't say that's a horrible match, you've obviously missed something. So I wasn't feeling great. I was starting to realize the irony of Matthias picking the crow well, because I was like, I'm going to eat crow matching this well in front of everyone. I did really like the rel perm sensitivity piece, because often I would just change it, run a model, change it, run a model. This one, you don't have a ton of history and you don't go through bubble point by a ton to see it, but it was neat to see, like in some parts, I might be able to match early later, but then I would sacrifice the match on that second piece after the buildup. So to just be able to kind of quickly run through a whole bunch of rel perms and just see there wasn't some magical set out there that would have matched it all. I was going to have to pick, okay, I'm matching the first part and not the second, or vice versa. So I really like that feature. Maybe like all engineers, if you've built a spreadsheet to do something, you kind of like to revert back to the spreadsheet. So I apologize, Matthias. But this is my spreadsheet and how I would normally have looked at it, that match. So it's kind of the same properties. But you can see again, kind of the solid gray was that match. And it looks okay there. And then you can kind of see for me that from the instantaneous LFP, started kind of flat, looked boundary dominated, staged a rallying recovery, which then was not going to be expected from anything. We had that shut in, and then you see what looks like a drop in productivity, but then flat. So for me, I was like, this is just going to be a tough one all around. And from the gas, you kind of see a boundary dominated signature of rising to start, and then a flatter GOR later. So again, not really telling the same story between oil and gas for at least what I could tweak rel perms with without spending a ton of time. Did the flowing material balance, picking a kind of early slope as the others. It's a very easy workflow and a great little check for sure. I admit I haven't used the flowing material balance a ton, so if anyone looks at this and thinks I missed something, I'd be glad to kind of see how that works. And then just finishing with my predictions. So it looks like I was on the smaller side of, oil cume, the 300. But again, as you can see, that I don't feel super confident. You could definitely have that OUP go up or down, which would affect this value. And I think kind of seeing that well, as some wells are just not going to match well if you have a shut in and you have a change in behavior. To me, that's you're going to have to pick one side, and other wells I would feel much more confident on. But that's the best I could do with with the well you gave, Matthias. So with that, I'll hand it back to you.
So we saw 3 different presentations now, and just the last thing I'll do, like what I was kind of, I don't know, it's just, I picked this as a well on purpose, obviously, because it's really tricky. And if you look at the well, like overall, the context there is like, it is a challenging well that we picked because it is challenging, obviously. But what makes it challenging? You know, when you saw this well right here, what specifically is making this well challenging? Like the first thing is in the numerical RTA, like diagnostic plot, for instance, you don't see any classical signatures. So that's like one thing. But the other thing, if you think in a practical sense, you literally have no other data than just the production data on this. So like we have to trust SP, and we have no like analog wells. We don't even have DCA public data, nothing. So only that makes it extremely challenging, right? Because it's back to Jason's point that you know, when you do RTA work, especially the power of it is when you do it on a lot of wells in the same area, and you have literally no other context as well. Second point is, of course, the production data was asked as a question here. We only have 1 year of production data, and the last thing is the bottom hole pressures here as well. So I think Braden used a smoothed version of the bottom hole pressures. I think Jason used actually a calculated version, which was the World Smart AR, and I think Brian used the gauge data or whatever we call it. There's some differences there in context that drives the result. But what I was surprised by was like when you actually compare some. I'm mainly focusing on EUR and OIP because that's at least the most relevant for this context. But so these are Brian's results there on like the final thing. One note that he did, which was a little bit different from the others, that he added this pressure dependent term in the matrix. But in short, around 415,000 barrels in EUR. Jason did not do that. We had a little bit different bottom hole pressure profile, but in terms of oil EUR was very similar. And then Braden, as he said, he picked somewhat of a smaller OIP, but you saw very easily if he added 30% there, you essentially get the same type of result, at least from a history matching perspective. And these are just the averages. So when I looked at this, like I was actually surprised with serving, like I wanted them to like really have like some very or more, I guess, disagreements here. But what I actually found interesting was that there was a lot of consistency across the different interpreters. So the first thing was that all the interpreters used more than only the numerical RTA workflow to guide the results. Specifically, all of them at least looked at the multi-phase FMB to question or guide their analysis, which is always healthy. And the last thing was that the water was questionable in all cases, so definitely should revisit with the geos. I think there is one trick you can do on the rel perms there to make the water match, but that'll be a discussion for later. Lastly, more on this well, if you looked at this in a fractional RTA perspective, and why I also think it's extremely hard to match with like a classical numerical R technique is that the delta is basically a perfect 0.3. So my interpretation, at least, the transitional flow, and really can't say with 100% certainty what the final OIP is. So it's tricky to use classical approaches. And what I've seen on these signatures where you have a delta of 0.3, very effective to include like gamma in the matrix for those to kind of force the classical trends to look, or unclassical behavior to look more classic, I think. So that was that. The last thing that we'll do is, or any questions related to this, by the way, maybe from the audience in the chat here as well. Yeah.
What's your timing for adding injected water volume?
One more time.
What's your timing for injecting water volume into the analysis?
Yeah. 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 So I think, so just to mention that, I'll repeat the question. So what is the timing to include the injection of water? I think two answers to that. First of all, here there was not only a problem to match the early time water, but it was basically a stabilized water cut. That was even a problem. So they would have to revisit anyway. On the injection of water, there's a few different things we're looking at implementing there in terms of how we're going to do it, whether it's just going to be something buckle lever twice or just try to honor the material balance and whatnot. I hope we get it in before Christmas, Stian, but we'll see. That's the pressure I'll put on Stian sits there. But as soon as possible, I think is the answer to that. But I think we'll prioritize multi-well before the water. We'll get there. A little bit my fear with the water thing is that it's something that we'll have there, and that people, when people ask, we can say yes, and people when the manager asks, they can say yes that we have it in there. But what I fear is that people with a hectic day, like actually doing that additional step, is probably something they'll skip. But maybe we'll see next year if they're going to do it or not. But we just have to make it bulletproof at least. That's my main, and simple enough, I think. So so ASAP is my answer, but very vague. Any other, Adrian?
Yeah, I was just curious about the matrix term. Does that also hold constant among everybody, or because the LFP kind of varies a lot, so it's curious about the matrix term.
Yeah, so since the LFP and OOP was different, like the resolved matrix terms was obviously different as well. The reason why I don't emphasize on that was like, it's a super big function of these other assumptions coming from SB. We don't really know where they come from. So I didn't want to focus on it. And it's also going back to you all, like to do RTA work on this level, which still has a lot of value, not using it to like try to resolve sex steps and stuff, but you want to have a physics-based comfort to either compare well performance or to do actually physics-based constrained forecast. You don't have to have that information, right? The only thing you need is production data, PVT and bottom up pressures, and that's it. And you just resolve LFPs and OIPs and you go at it. So that's also to emphasize that. Any other questions? Okay, perfect. So food will be served very, very soon. We'll take a quick break. During that break, I want everyone that's here in person to just do me a favor, since I'm so excited to have all of you here. If we can just take a little picture together in that room in there, that would be great. We super appreciate it. And after that, we'll be back here. We'll be 4 chairs here. We'll remove this guy. We'll put the camera on the panel. I'm going to make sure that Bruce is going to have at least 1 wine glass before he goes in there. So, so I'm going to get the war stories from there. But that's the game plan in short. So we'll try to be back. Yeah, since we'll get food and everything, we'll probably be 20 minutes or so. But hopefully, when we get the food, if Claudia, Bruce, Gustavo, and Steven can take first, so they get a little bit of food before we get started, and then everybody else just after that, and then we do the panel while we eat, if that's okay with everyone. Perfect.
Ja. Så var det ett antal där här, men det behöver lys även där.
Jag tar det här sen. Ja.
Just då kör vi bara detta, så tar vi bara inte vägen.
Ja, det är inte dumt. Glasögon. It's from Curtis. Huh? Look inside, there's a note there. It's from Curtis. It's page number 1. A life of face behavior. You need to have this is the D go-to book on PVT. Okay. So now you have a copy signed by the author and top. All the special people.
I didn't look inside, so now that has my name on it.
You have to take it, huh? Good boss.
Good job. I can't stick around for the flight of darts, so that will be fun. I've got
yeah, that's
my Malaysian reserves meeting.
But you'll join the you'll look at a panel because I'll
hang out for the panel. May I come down? That'll be good.
Yeah, that'll be good. I was a little bit internet connection, doing it virtual and everything. It's always. Shalhan? So we're gonna get started with the panel now, but now the camera is not on the audience; it's on the panel. That's just because everybody's drinking and eating food in the audience. But
making remarks about the panelists.
Yeah, making remarks about the panelists. Exactly.
I'm glad we gave them stuff to throw. That was a good idea.
That's good.
Yeah, why did you do that to us?
We need the screen like in the Blues Brothers.
Exactly. So there will only be, I guess, audio for this, and the picture of the people in the panel, which is fine. Just before we get started here, so the panel is supposed to be a little bit of a light ending to today, wrap up a few thoughts, but we'll try to keep it very practical, like Brock said earlier, no equations, and we're going to try to do that. And hopefully my goal is to be able to have some war stories from Bruce, because he's been through a lot in a good way.
Most of it good.
Most of it good. So the panel, the objective of the panel is that we see time and time again that the biggest hurdle when it comes to doing any type of well performance analysis or production data analysis is not the analysis itself. Okay, it can be things like getting high quality data. It can be getting the relevant data, proper tools, number of licenses, etc., or just having something as simple as time to do the work. And there's a lot more as well. So the objective of this panel is to share some of the thinking around practical aspects when it comes to production data analysis, ways it can be improved, and of course, some war stories from Bruce. And it says here, from back in the heydays. That's what it says. So just to introduce the panelists, I would consider all of them friends of mine, which is great, and friends of the community, which is also good. Bruce, you've been in the industry for more than 30 plus years. 40 plus. I try to be nice to you, Bruce. So Bruce has been with us for a long time. That's why we like him. Your education is from UT Austin, and he's been at Shell. I think that was your first job. He has been at multiple different companies, Chesapeake, Devon, to mention a few. Now he's with Ranger. What I like with that is that he's done like super big companies, medium-sized companies, and smaller companies over a long period of time, using a lot of different tools, a lot of different roles internally. So welcome to you, Bruce.
Thank you.
Then we have Claudia. She's been in the industry for more than 20 years. And she's also had multiple roles. Also, actually, a colleague of Bruce in Chesapeake. Most recently, she was in Newfield that became Encana, or merged with Encana, or got bought by Encana, which is now Ovintiv. And your background is from both the OU and now recently Harvard as well. So welcome to Claudia. And we also have Gustavo with us. What I really like with Gustavo is that he has been both at PDVSA, Halliburton, and now BPX. So he has both the service industry, national oil company, and operator here in the US. So that's cool. And your background is from Heriot-Watt University as well. Anything else? Any school that I forgot? That's it. Excellent. And then we have my good friend Stephen Young. Your background is from A&M, correct? Yeah. And after that, you went to Devon and been there ever since. So that's very easy to remember. One company. Still hanging in there. Yeah. So the first thing I'll kick the kind of the panel off with is. We've done a lot of work today. We talked about a lot of different things, well performance analysis, but this is not new stuff. Like Petkovic did kind of RTA work or rate time analysis work, etc. From maybe 70s and the 80s, and that time frame make it very natural for me to start with you, Bruce. In your first oil and gas job, when it came to like accessing and utilizing data and building models, can you kind of loop us through that?
Yeah, for sure. Well, for you guys, let me get the first drink, but he also made me promise to say something nice about Woodson. So right off the bat, so let me say something really nice about this whole consortium. It's fabulous that we're across different companies and we're able to come together and talk about reservoir engineering, because unfortunately, unless you're in a really big company, and even in really big companies, that doesn't happen that much anymore. When I graduated in '81, my first job was literally, I don't know for you guys that remember the Wood Creek facility, the Shell facility on Derry Ashford. Well, my first week there, they hadn't even poured the sidewalks yet. And so I've lived through the entire incarnation of a building. It's gone now. So my first week at Shell, and I'm a mechanical engineer, so I started out as a production engineer, and they're introducing me around to the employees, and there's this come to this office with this little man that's probably my age back then, sitting there with one piece of paper and a pencil and no computer. And I want to introduce you to Mr. Vogel. And I'm like, oh, okay. I'd never heard of Vogel because I wasn't a petroleum engineer, right? And they go, that's Jack Vogel. I'm like, well, who's that? And like, the Jack Vogel. But to Matthias's point, Jack was an incredible analytical modeler, and he was actually a better reservoir engineer than he was a production engineer, believe it or not. And I started in the thermal group at Shell, and we handled a bunch of California fields. And so Jack was my go-to guy for analytical equations, and he'd write them out very legibly on paper and I'd take them to the copy room and reproduce them, and then I'd go punch them into my TI-59 and come up with steam targets for steam floods in California. So
for the audience here, like a TI-59, like I don't really know.
You don't
what
even
it
know
is.
what a TI-59
is. we elaborate.
Hand calculator, right? You had to use hand calculators in college. So we've come a long way since then. And one of the beauties of the shelf back in the old days, the Bel Air Research Lab, is we had all these guys, these pioneers in petroleum engineering that we could go sit and spend time with. And you know, the first reservoir visualization came out, and I'm like, oh my God, we can actually visualize this stuff and how it moves through time, and look at how these streamlines work, and so it's just been, to me, I mean, been a real, obviously fascinating to watch it all transition, but the part of the analytical side of it that we kind of lose focus these days is because too many reservoir engineers rely on the punching buttons into a numerical model and not thinking about what's actually happening in the reservoir. Okay, and back then you kind of had to, and Shell was really emphasized this, you had to think about the recovery process that was going on. Was it fluid expansion? Was it solution gas? Was it gravity drainage? Was it, you know, what's happening in the reservoir? And you would get grilled constantly from these reservoir, my reservoir mentors at least, in terms of trying to quantify that. How much of this is gravity drainage? How much is this? And so that's kind of how I learned early on. And you get a little bit too toolsy and a little bit too cute on the numerical side, and you kind of, you always, when you're running these models, you should be thinking about what they're telling you or why they're telling you what they're telling you, right? So I'll just leave you with this. It's like, when I used to run simulations at The Hague and in Ricewhite, I would visualize what was going on in the reservoir. I'd try to visualize it, and I'd go to the simulator to check my physics to make sure that what I thought was going on in my mind was actually mathematically correct. Because the simulator isn't going to tell you what to do, right? It's not going to tell you where to drill wells. It's not going to tell you. It's going to quantify things for you and check your physics for you. Anyway. I'll stop.
No, but that's a great thing because, you know, I'll flip it 180 degrees to you, Stephen. And the reason is you guys are kind of representing two extremes, at least in this panel, because when you joined, you know, Devon, it was a different time. You had more sophisticated tools, maybe more, you know, click of a button tools, more push to do like numerical stuff. And I remember, you know, Curtis has some good stories from that as well, through consulting work where, you know, they were suggesting doing, you know, simple flow material balance techniques, etc. But no, everything had to be full physics numerical models because that's more correct. So have we kind of gone a step too far that, you know, the simple analytical stuff, we're not critical enough and we're just clicking buttons? And how has that been since you started in, you know, 10 plus years ago at Devon from your perspective?
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on for what we've seen. And we've, at least in my 10, 11 years, and we started trying to get very technical, and everything needed a full numerical model to make any decision. And I think we swung, frankly, too far on that pendulum, and now we're very much pulling back to using it exactly as Bruce is saying, for more of a you know, gut check on, hey, does this make sense for what our assumptions are? So we got very excited early on you know, some of the big data stuff we could do and pulling everything into, you know, some other software, we'll call it. And you'd have results coming out of those that you could sit back and say, does this make any sense? It's like, no, it doesn't. And it would take 2 minutes of somebody else looking over your shoulder, looking at some of the data that was auto imported in that just makes no sense. And a lot of decisions were being made on data that made no sense, but it was there already. And so then just too often it was taken as gospel and just ran with. So that's been a big change internally, is trying to make sure we're using all of our tools more appropriately and just only using those more advanced tools when it's, you know, actually necessary, as opposed to saying you have to go to this step to make X decision.
Yeah, because there's no doubt that, like, with time we've gotten so much more data, more fine resolution data, etc. But is this data valuable or not? And that's obviously the question many times. And On that question, since Claudia, you've done like a a very recent degree in this kind of space, correct? On big data and data analytics, etc. So what's your take on this? Like, do we have too much data? Do we really need more data, or can we never get saturated in data? What's your thought?
As a history of this for our industry specifically, right? I read, well, not recently, but I came across article by McKinsey. In 2015, when right after the downturn, McKinsey's a management consulting firm. They went and surveyed our industry, and they decided that, based on their survey, only 1% of our data was being used by the decision makers. 1%. And they didn't even dabble into the quality of that 1% data that was being used. Now, so the industry, obviously, we try to catch up and modernize our data infrastructure systems and make it more accessible, quality data. And a lot of data management has, transpired since then, right? Management and governance in our organizations. Now, fast forward a few years later, there's another article by BCG, Boston Consulting Group, also another large consulting management firm. In 2018-19, they went back and benchmarked the whole industry, top firms within the industry with other top firms in the finance, health, tech industries, and just benchmark as to how we're using the data, how is our data management system coming along, data infrastructure, and so on and so forth. We were still lagging. We were making progress from the 2015 survey, but we're still lagging behind, and they tie that to value, right? Like there's value in how the different industries are using this data. So we have made huge progress, but still we're leveraging and making decisions on a very small percentage of the data that we have available. So the question to me will be the quality of the data and how we are using the data. Because if you think about it, on the side, something else has been happening in our world. After the downturn, what's happening to our staffing levels? What's happening to the technical analysis that actually has to go along with what Bruce and Steven are saying? We have to actually keep the human in the loop, so to speak. So we have this, more data, accessible data, quality data coming our way, and we have less and less talent pool to actually go in there and dabble to that. So I think, to me, personally speaking, I think we can have a lot of data, and we have a lot of coming our ways. And it's always, comparatively speaking, might vary, right? If you're going to go compared to NASA, we probably are not going to be quite there yet, right? They move, petabytes on, real time. We might not be there quite yet, but we are moving. Another article or survey showed, this one is by, I can't recall the name, ISH, I think he was one of those, but it's saying that about 1 terabyte per well is what we're moving right now. 1 terabyte of data per well. And that is, if you think about it, a large amount of data that was coming our way. And how are we going to analyze that? It comes down to, are we going to rely a lot on all these buzzwords and ML, AI, ML, and all these other techniques? I think they have their purpose. I think they're very valuable. But how are we going to keep the human in the loop? And I think it's not necessarily the old traditional way of keeping the human in the loop. I think we have to learn to harvest the value of this data, new data management systems and new techniques to evaluate it. Mainly computational power that is available at our fingertips, right? But it's about keeping the human in the loop and not losing that high-end technical capability. But I'm going to flip it too. Right? It's good to gut check what we believe our theoretical model is. But this in the unconventionals, quite frankly, it started in 2000 mainly years, so it's what, 22 years. Is our mental check? Do we actually have it all figured out? It also is good to challenge our mental model with the data that is coming at us.
Just before we park that one, and I have a couple of other notes on the resource thing, but do you think we gather too much data, or do we do too little analysis? You see the difference there? Like, do we as an industry, do we really need like fiber data down to like the millisecond to do an analysis of whether there's like 80% cluster efficiency type of thing? Like, you see where I'm getting at, or what's your take on that?
My take on it, I think we need to be strategic as to how we collect the data. We have a lot of data. I think data is good. We need to understand the value of the data that we're collecting. How is it fitting in the overall value that we're trying to deliver. Now, keep in mind, we're asked to deliver value today. We will be asked to deliver value tomorrow and 2 years from now, 10 years from now, right? So I think this strategy is one of those key important components that we need to understand why we're gathering what we're gathering in the context of what we already have, what we already know, and where we wish to attain.
And on that note, like a very big thing with, having data is great, collecting data is great, databasing it is great, but internally in a company, if the data is not accessible to the people in the company, like data liberation, it's kind of a big issue. At least, we've been lucky to work with 60, 70 companies over here, and versus a lot of the NOCs companies that we work with, like, it's much more accessible to get data here than other places, and I think that's just positive. But maybe we have more work to do. So I'll pass it over to you, Gustavo, because you worked for a national oil company. So when you worked in a national oil company versus where you're working right now, for instance, when it comes to accessing data, getting approval to look at different data sets, etc., can you comment a little bit on that?
Absolutely. So I see, a great progress, particularly in those kind of democratization of the data. So in the national oil company, there's some restriction about the budget. So, not all the national companies have all the necessary money to acquire all the data as possible. But at the private company, of course, have a more accessibility, a better information and quality. So to me, most important aspect is the quality of the data. So she's right. So we are using only 1% of the data, but the problem is the quality of this. And clear example is, when you can see the pressure and the rate in those well information, pressure go up and the rate go up, and they say, what? So something that we can understand very well. So cleaning the data is something that we need to spend time. One of the big issues that we have, not only in national company, but also in those super major, is timing, our time, and people that apply, all the science and looking the detail that Bruce mentioned before. So how we can clean, how we can, understand the data. So that is to me, most of the more important focus of how we can use that data for the future, for any integration.
So being more thoughtful about what data we collect, and then, we talked about also resources, to have enough resources. We've had a downturn the last few years with COVID and everything. People were wiped out. Like, it's literally not less than 18 months ago. I remember it was almost depressing going to LinkedIn and stuff. Do you remember that time? That's 18 months ago. And like, I thought this is going to be a dark year. Like, I thought a lot of us, like, this was dark times. I remember I was like, on the behalf of the industry, I was kind of like a little bit depressed because, there was so few job postings and there was so many people that were like up for hire. And now everything is just flipped upside down, and people can't find, good technical folks with the quality, the good quality fast enough. So what do you think happened there, Bruce?
I think